What do we want to talk about?
I am him. I am him.
Hey, this is the Red Carpet Ring featuring TBK, the Turnbuckle King. We are back once again, and we're here to talk about Kane, Mayor Kane, My Life of Wrestling, and Politics Audio Part 2. So we're continuing on from yesterday's audiobook. I think we last started at chapter 4, where he really gets into the Isaac Yankum DDS character, the wrestler and dentist. So this is part 2. As I stated before, part 1. If you want to see part 1 of the audiobook, it will be in description in part 2. I will have the description listed below. Should be in there, no problem, but each his own. That's how it will be. Other than that, guys, we're going to do part 2 here tonight. Hit the like, subscribe as you come into the ring. And after part 2, there will be a part 3. So we'll listen more of Kane's audiobook. With that being said, let's continue on. Mayor Kane, My Life in Wrestling and Politics audiobook, part 2.
Fireworks rocked the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, a.k.a. the Igloo, as Bret Hitman Hart made his grand entrance into the ring at WWE's SummerSlam in August 1995. On the other side of the ring stood his opponent, me. Earlier that month, while still wrestling in SMW, I had traveled to Stamford to meet with representatives of WWE's creative services. They showed me the outfit they had designed for my new alter ego, Isaac Yankum, DDS. The costume consisted of black boots, blue pants, and a white lab smock that served as a ring jacket. They also provided me with a headset equipped with magnifying lenses like the one used by a dentist and a black leather doctor's bag. Finally, they told me that Vince thought it would be ironic if his wrestling dentist had poor oral hygiene. So they gave me a couple of bottles of black and brown acrylic paint. We experimented with painting my teeth to give them a decayed look. While I was there, I met Howard Finkel, WWE's longtime ring announcer. Howard informed me that he had suggested Needles, Washington as Isaac Yankum's hometown, but Vince liked Decatur, Illinois. Get it? Decay-tor. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard my entrance music for the first time. Instead of a cool rock song with powerful guitar riffs and pounding drums, my music was the sound of a dentist's drill whirling away. After meeting with creative services, I filmed a series of vignettes in Stamford at a real dentist's office. Isaac Yankum was made out to be Jerry Lawler's personal dentist. After losing a Kiss My Foot match with Bret Hart, Lawler was using Yankum's wrestling services to exact revenge on the Hitman. The vignettes portrayed me, along with Lawler, pulling my patient's teeth, sans anesthesia, of course. The last one was pretty cute. It was simply an answering machine with the message that my office was closed until I dispatched Bret Hart at SummerSlam. The Friday before the match, I met Bill Watts and Brett at WWE's training facility to put together the SummerSlam match. Watts had recently joined WWE to replace J.J. Dillon as head of talent relations. J.J. had recently departed to work for WCW, an early shot across the bow in the Monday Night War. Watts, the promoter and wrestler of Mid-South Wrestling, was famous for his no-nonsense demeanor. After working out that day, I felt that we had a good game plan for SummerSlam. The next day, I flew to Pittsburgh, picked up a rental car, and checked into a Red Roof Inn where I was reunited with my friend from Puerto Rico and now my travel partner, Dutch Mantel. The SummerSlam match was passable. Of course, it didn't hurt that I was in the ring with Bret Hart, one of the greatest performers ever. Still, I did my part too. Unfortunately, I was unhappy with the Yankum character and having trouble adjusting to WWE, the big leagues of sports entertainment. After all, a few short months before, I had been watching people like Bret Hart on TV. Now, I was a peer. It was a difficult transition for me, and the SummerSlam match against Bret proved to be the highlight of Yankum's WWE run. The night after SummerSlam was a live Monday Night Raw in Erie, Pennsylvania. I had an enhancement match, a short, one-sided match meant to build the winner's allure, during which I beat a young Scott Taylor, the future Scotty 2 Hottie of Too Cool fame. Our match was terrible, and everyone, including me, knew it. The cracks were showing. After debuting as a featured performer with Bret at SummerSlam, I was soon relegated to mid-card status. My WWE career seemed to be spiraling downward before it had even started. Occasionally, I showed flashes of brilliance, but for the most part, my matches were uninspired mediocrity. After one particularly bad performance during a TV match against Undertaker, Mark pulled me aside for a come-to-Jesus talk. "Look," he told me point blank, "you have to start acting like you belong here. Vince likes you, but you have to get more aggressive, or you won't make it." Not long after that, Vince himself gave me a similar talk. An important lesson. I had a decision to make. I could continue to mope around feeling sorry for myself because I was saddled with a character that I hated, or I could make the most of what I had and do the best that I could to prove I belonged in WWE. I chose the latter, and that decision saved my career. My matches got better, and WWE kept me busy on TV and live events, usually in the role of jobber to the stars. In other words, my role was to provide top talent with a competitive opponent. The term jobber is not one I use a lot. The connotation is degrading and disrespectful. Not everyone is going to be a star in the wrestling business, but I think that everyone in the wrestling business deserves at least a modicum of respect from their colleagues and fans for their willingness to go out there and try. I've seen job guys who are tremendously talented, but have just never gotten their break. I've also seen stars whose work was mediocre and who treated their colleagues and fans like dirt. Besides, without jobbers, people who make the stars look good, where would the business be? Around this time, WWE was experiencing the rise of a group soon to be known as The Clique. Shawn Michaels, Triple H, still Hunter Hearst Helmsley back then, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Sean Waltman. In fact, The Clique wasn't the only clique in the locker room. Several groups of guys traveled and hung out together. Nor, in my opinion, was The Clique as divisive as they are sometimes portrayed. Did they wield a lot of power? Yes, but so did a guy like Undertaker, and Mark and the Clique always got along fine. I never had a problem with them. In fact, Sean and Kevin went out of their ways to make me look good in my matches with them. Triple H and I were occasional travel partners. Sean Waltman would later become one of my favorite tag team partners. Did the Clique target people they didn't like? Probably. But here's the reality about WWE and, for that matter, everything else that involves human beings. Politics are part of it. And if you want to be successful, you better be able to navigate your way through. This is true in everything, from the business world to professional sports. From what I saw of the Clique, if they thought you could draw money and you tried to get along with them, things were fine. At least they were in my case. WWE is truly a global company. During my stint as Isaac Yankum DDS, I performed in Europe, India, Kuwait, and South Africa. With WWE's intense touring schedule, we were rarely anywhere for more than a day. So it was a nice change to spend a couple days at the Sun City Resort in South Africa in preparation for a pay-per-view special. Sun City boasted a massive water park and world-class golf. I'm not much of a golfer, but I couldn't resist hitting the links when I heard crocodiles inhabited the water hazards. It was set up in such a way that the crocs couldn't get to the players or anyone else, but I had to see them. Fake Diesel. While we were in South Africa, Jerry Briscoe, then a WWE road agent, told me to call Vince when I returned stateside. Road agents are WWE staffers, often former wrestlers, who produce matches, look after talent during shows, and serve as a conduit between the office and talent. I called the office as soon as I arrived home. Ann Russo, with Talent Relations, informed me that Vince had an idea for me. WCW, our main competitor, had recently lured away two of WWE's biggest stars, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. In WWE, Hall was Razor Ramon and Nash was Diesel. Vince wanted WWE commentator Jim Ross, aka JR, to portray a bitter, vengeful employee determined to prove that he was the one responsible for WWE's success. In the storyline, JR recruited a new Razor, portrayed by Rick Bogner. Vince wanted me to become what everyone would call fake Diesel. The storyline was JR had presented a new Ramon and Diesel to the fans to show he was the real star maker in the company. JR would prove to the world that he, not Vince, was the creative genius behind WWE. I was excited about the storyline, which I saw as an opportunity to shed the Isaac Yankum character and move on to something different. I had matured both in the ring and outside of it. By this time, I was confident that I belonged in WWE, but believed that the Yankum character carried too much baggage to allow me to shine. In life, having confidence in one's abilities is often what makes you or breaks you. I've found that to be true in sports and business. If you convince yourself that you're capable of doing something, you stand a good chance of achieving your goal, even if you don't actually possess all the necessary skills or tools. Likewise, you can have everything you need to succeed, but if you don't believe in yourself, you can sabotage your own success. The same was true when I decided to run for mayor. I really had no idea what I was doing. It was completely different than anything I had ever done. People would suggest things throughout the campaign, and I would be like, that sounds like a good idea. I think I'll try it. Because I had confidence, I wasn't afraid to take risks. We ran our entire campaign by the seat of our pants. I wasn't a seasoned politician, and that was a big part of my appeal. I believed in myself and was always willing to do unconventional things. Though my lack of political experience scared me at times, I filled those voids with life lessons I had learned in WWE. Not to mention, I used my sports entertainment persona to strengthen my political appeal. I brought WWE superstars like Ric Flair, Undertaker, Big Show, Daniel Bryan, Matt Hardy, Mark Henry, and Ricky Morton, and others into Knoxville for campaign-related appearances. I was determined to be a different kind of candidate because I was confident. Various veteran political experts would advise me that I shouldn't do this or that. Whatever they told me not to do, that's usually exactly what I did. If I had listened to any of the people who wanted to treat me like a vanilla candidate, I would have had a hard time succeeding. I went with my gut because I knew how to connect with people better than they did. I knew what would work. I knew this in part because I didn't know what I was doing. Now, I'm not saying I didn't accept good advice or listen to others. I would be a fool not to. But I always remembered what an old high school coach told me. Because I wasn't an aggressive person, he told me I needed to step outside of my personality. He said I needed to get out of my comfort zone. In running for office, I did just that in a big way, but I was always confident and it worked. Similarly, over 20 years ago, I made a conscious decision that I was going to be a WWE superstar no matter what. That doesn't mean that I knew everything or I could handle any situation flawlessly. It just meant that I followed the old adage, fake it until you make it. By the time the new Razor and Diesel debuted, my in-ring work had noticeably improved. Backstage, I was treated differently. Not necessarily like a top star, but much more deferentially than when I was the dentist. Even Vince made a point to applaud my performance and new attitude. Unfortunately, WWE fans rejected the entire storyline. Conceptually, it wasn't a bad idea, but instead of embracing the underlying plotline, which was somewhat complex and confusing, they refused to accept the new Razor and Diesel as anything but imitations of the originals. It didn't help that JR was a popular character who was hard to dislike. People ask me what Kevin Nash thought about the gimmick. I don't think that he and I have ever really discussed it. Besides, the storyline was not intended to ridicule Kevin and Scott in any way. WWE treated Rick and me as serious competitors, even championship contenders, not as bumbling buffoons there to poke fun at. It was just one of those things that happen so often in the world of sports entertainment, an off-the-wall idea that never found legs. Around this time, WWE established a working relationship with Mexico's AAA promotion. A number of AAA stars appeared on WWE programming, most notably their many Estrella Luchador versions of WWE superstars like Vader, Mankind, and Goldust. In exchange, WWE sent Rick and me to work in Mexico on and off for a few months. In Mexico, we wrestled a lot in traditional 6-man, 2 out of 3 fall matches with Lucha Libre legends like Perro Aguayo and Perroth Jr. While it wasn't exactly WWE, I enjoyed learning the Lucha Libre style and tradition. One particular trip to Mexico proved very eventful. I flew from home to Mexico City, where we had a match that night. The next day, everyone flew to Juarez to work that evening. When we arrived in Juarez, we had to go through an immigration checkpoint, which was strange since it was a domestic flight. The Mexican immigration officials gave Rick and me a difficult time before allowing us to go on. We performed at the show in Juarez that night, but the next day, things took an unexpected turn. The following morning, we returned to Juarez to catch a flight back to Mexico City. The same immigration officials who had been there the day before were checking passports. Again, this was strange, since passports are not usually required to board domestic flights. In any case, Rick and I were told there was a problem with our passports and we were not allowed to board the plane. The officers told us to return to the airport in a couple of hours to meet with their supervisor and straighten things out. We returned to our hotel, which was a short walk from the American border. In search of a payphone, I crossed the bridge over the Rio Grande River leading into El Paso. Remember, this is 1997, long before cell phones were ubiquitous. First, I tried calling the AAA office, but no one picked up. I then called WWE and explained the situation. They put me on with their in-house immigration attorney. He instructed me to cooperate with the Mexican officials and said we'd get everything worked out. When Rick and I returned to the airport, the immigration officials loaded us into a beat-up Crown Victoria and drove us to their headquarters. The HQ was located at the base of the bridge to the United States, the same bridge I'd crossed earlier that day. In the office, the supervisor asked for our passports and looked them over. He then informed us that we were working in Mexico illegally. The papers in our passports were not work visas. They were applications for work visas. The visas had never been issued. There was obviously a mix-up, I said. We could get everything straightened out when we got back to the United States. He replied with the most terrifying words I have ever heard. "Oh, you can't leave." My mind immediately began racing. Simply put, going to jail in Mexico wasn't high on my bucket list, to say the least. Within a second, I had devised a plan. Basically, taking out the officers at the knees and sprinting across the bridge, leaping into the arms of the first American border guard I could find. Luckily, nothing that dramatic occurred. We were fined a modest sum, which required a wire transfer from WWE since the Mexican officials couldn't process credit cards, then given back our passports and sent on our way. While I laugh about it now, I'll never forget the sinking feeling of seeing my passport in that official's hands and knowing I was completely at his mercy. Rick and I finished our run in Mexico and then began working for USWA and my former dental patient, Jerry Lawler. Then I got a call that would change my life. Chapter 4. The Big Red Machine in the Attitude Era. There are arguably few better right time, right place scenarios in the history of sports entertainment. Vince already liked my work, and me personally, and was looking for a worthy opponent for Undertaker. I was past ready to finally make my mark. I'll never forget how it all came together. Or I guess I should say, I'll never forget how nearly all of it came together. Creating Kane. While still on loan from WWE to Jerry Lawler's USWA in Memphis, I got a call from either Vince's longtime creative partner Bruce Pritchard or Jim Cornette. Surprisingly, that's the one thing I can't remember. Whichever one called me told me they had an idea for a new character. Originally, this new wrestler was going to be hot-shotted, pushed immediately into a program with Undertaker, with little story built. If I recall correctly, the immediate need for such a character had something to do with Leon White, aka WWE superstar Vader, who had gotten into trouble in Kuwait. Again, right place, right time. Then I was told the character's name, Inferno. Wait, I thought. You mean to tell me, after saddling me with Isaac Yankum and fake Diesel, you are going to call me Inferno? I hated it. More importantly, Bruce hated it probably even more than I did, and went to bat for me to change it. Thankfully, that worked, and we moved on to Kane, a name Bruce has always liked. Bruce has a son named Kane. Many will recall that the original name for Taker was Kane, the Undertaker, which was also Bruce's idea. Obviously, Kane evokes the biblical brothers Cain and Abel, and the entire idea for Kane from the beginning was that I would be Undertaker's brother. I believe that was what Vince envisioned from the start. Vince liked the character so much that he wanted to put me in the slot as Taker's next opponent. WWE brought me up to Binghamton, New York, where a show was being held, and I brought my old Doomsday, aka Unabomb outfit. The get-up for Doomsday in Puerto Rico was basically the same as the get-up for Unabomb in Smoky Mountain. I wasn't there to wrestle that night. Vince just wanted to see me and talk about the character. I put on my old gimmicks, and Vince loved it. I thought Doomsday and Unabomber or something that looked similar was going to be Kane. Then I saw sketches of my outfit. It didn't look anything like what I had envisioned. I looked more like a superhero. I talked to Taker about it and laid out my vision. I told Mark I saw Kane as more like an escaped mental patient, or perhaps even the maniacal hockey mask wearing Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th horror movie franchise. Yet the Kane mock-up I had been shown looked more like a comic book crusader who would fly through the skies, cape and everything. How in the world could that be Kane? About this time, I began to see Paul Bearer on TV talking more and more about Kane, building up my debut. I thought, holy cow, this is actually about to happen. I could tell it was going to be a big deal. I felt the pressure mounting. This had to be done right. That's when I finally got the courage to call Vince and tell him what I thought. He said he understood where I was coming from about the look of my character. It made me feel better. But Vince also said I was wrong about who Kane really was. Kane was not someone from a mental institution or a mere sadist. Kane, Vince insisted, has a scarred ego. He's a tortured soul, compensating for his ugliness and emotional dysfunction by becoming a superhero. Also, he's not disfigured as much as he perceives he's disfigured. That's just another example of how insecure and unfulfilled Kane is. After listening, I had just one thought. Vince is a genius. In the end, I got the look I wanted, but the ultimate credit for creating the Big Red Machine, Kane, goes to Vince. I know Bruce and some of the others had a hand in developing Kane, but in the end, it came down to the boss and his vision. With a better understanding by all involved of what the Kane character should look like and what his true nature would be, WWE started putting together what would become Kane's costume. At a Monday Night Raw in Atlantic City, New Jersey, I met with Vince, Bruce, and JR to don the outfit for the first time. Everyone loved it, including me. Vince kept stressing that the operative word with Kane was cool. JR responded, "No, what would be cool?" He then brought up shock rock singer Marilyn Manson, who at the time was at the height of his career, and noted that during performances, the singer wore one contact lens that made his eye look sinister. So in addition to the costume, there would be the spooky eye that would become so integral to the overall Kane character. Compliments of good old JR and Marilyn Manson. But we should really take a moment to talk about my mask. The mask. The Kane character would end up having long hair. Luckily, I had grown mine long for the fake Diesel character. I hadn't cut it in forever, simply because no one had ever told me to. I would soon learn the many painful difficulties of having both long hair and a mask. I'm not exactly sure who came up with the original leather mask concept, but I do know we couldn't initially find anyone to make it. After being turned away by several companies, we finally found a couple in their 30s in New York City who did this kind of work. Their main clientele? People into S&M and bondage wear. I swear. They were the nicest people you could possibly meet, and you would have never thought in a million years this was the kind of work they did. Terry Anderson, who has been designing costumes for WWE since 1989, had made my outfit and would make all of them over the years. Still, the mask was a special project. The mask was not only stitched together and dyed, but had to be molded correctly because it had creases. The couple took a mold of my face and then soaked the leather in water. It was the first time I had a full head mold. They then put the leather in an oven to cure and harden to create the creases. The mask was expensive to make, and after the first one, Terry Anderson figured out how to make all my masks. Believe me, There were many. That's because my sweat and rough handling caused them to discolor so much that they had to be replaced every 4 or 5 months. People often ask what happened to the old ones. I have given a few away. Bruce Pritchard has one. I gave one of my masks to a little boy with a heart condition. I gave another to the big boss man for charity. Today, I still have some, including the one Undertaker ripped off my head at SummerSlam 2000 in Raleigh, North Carolina. The most recent masks are latex. Fans often ask if I could breathe, but that was never a problem. Once, though, I sliced myself badly under the mask, a cut caused by the force of hitting my head during a power slam. It was the crease in the leather that did it. It had become sharp and cut me. I could see my blood dripping onto the mat. When I got backstage and took my mask off, I was like, great, just great. The worst thing about the mask were the brass rivets that connected them to the straps that held them on my head. I would always put the mask on, then pull my hair through the straps. Throughout matches, the rivets would catch in my hair. My hair tangles easily, and every time I would take off my mask, it would twist and damage my hair. I used tons of conditioner in an attempt to prevent this, but it didn't help. Each time I pulled off the mask, the brass rivets would shred my hair. My hair was long and beautiful then, and a pain to take care of. Debut at Bad Blood. Starting in April of 1997, WWE began building to my debut. With Undertaker and his former manager, Paul Bearer, officially on the outs, Taker threw a fireball in Paul's face. Later, Paul would emerge with bandages all over his face due to the attack. Bearer wanted to rejoin with Taker and said if he didn't take him back, he would reveal the dead man's biggest secret. Guess who? Bearer said that the fire that damaged his face was not unlike another fire long ago when Undertaker was a child. Taker refused to realign with Paul. That's when Paul Bearer vowed to bring back Undertaker's long-lost brother, Kane, to challenge the dead man. Yes! Yes! Bearer said Taker had murdered his family by setting fire to their home, a funeral home, killing everyone except Kane. The tragedy had scarred Kane mentally and physically, Bearer said, and now there would be hell to pay for Taker. Undertaker said Paul had it backward. He said that I was the pyromaniac, that I had started the fire, and there was no way I could have possibly survived the furious blaze caused by my own hand. Little did he know. The weekend before Bad Blood, I went to the warehouse in Stamford where I put on the outfit. I then worked out as Kane and practiced the same moves Undertaker did. Everything from the sit-up to the tombstone pile driver. For those unfamiliar, the pile driver is when a wrestler holds his opponent upside down by the waist and then forcefully lowers him straight down to the mat. Taker's famous version was dubbed the tombstone. Cornette was there, helping me every step of the way. He said the cage they would be using was chain-linked, complete with a roof to prevent escape, a throwback to the old NWA War Games matches. This would all lead to my debut at the pay-per-view Bad Blood in October 1997 during the main event between Undertaker and Shawn Michaels in the very first Hell in a Cell match. And it was a debut that almost didn't happen. Bad Blood was to be held in St. Louis near my hometown, so I flew in a few days early to visit with friends and family. Since I didn't bother renting a car, my old friend, Mark Morton, offered me a ride to the arena on the day of the show. Mark still dabbled in wrestling with some local groups, had begun a family, and was pursuing a master's degree and career in social work. I figured it would be a good chance for us to catch up. It was a great way to start my big day. Well, I thought it was. Until Mark arrived. He pulled up to my parents' house in the worst beater car I had ever seen. This bucket of bolts barely looked drivable. It was awful. Apparently, his wife had taken their other car, the nice one. In retrospect, I should have never gotten in, but I thought, okay, whatever, and we hit the road. About 45 minutes outside of St. Louis, something happened that I never would have believed had I not seen it with my own eyes. I looked down and saw, I kid you not, smoke coming out of the cassette player. How does that even happen? I said, dude, your car is on fire. He looked over, shocked to see the smoke billowing out of the cassette player. Predictably, the next thing you know, there was a loud pop and the engine chugged to a halt. As the car lost power, Mark pulled off the road. So there we were, stuck on the side of I-70. My first thought was that this would be the shortest-lived debut in WWE history. I wouldn't even make it to the arena. Smoke was pouring out from under the hood, but luckily Mark had a cell phone. He called someone else to pick me up to get me to the show. Fortunately, even after that bizarre scare, I still arrived at the arena 2 hours early. Only Vince, JR, Bruce, Cornette, and Taker knew I was debuting that night. At that time, before the Kane character was unveiled, I was not yet a marquee name. No one was really concerned with me or what I might have been doing that night, even though I had been on the roster for some time. Later that evening, we learned some tragic news. Brian Pillman had died the night before in Minneapolis at age 35. Many knew Brian had not made his way to St. Louis for the pay-per-view. Now we were finding out why. An autopsy attributed his death to a heart attack. Unfortunately, I'd never really gotten to know Brian, and amazingly, I don't think we ever met. When he came to WWE, I was busy wrestling in Mexico or for Jerry Lawler in Memphis. Still, it was a dark cloud that hung over that evening. I didn't realize it at the time, but Bad Blood would be a day of many firsts. When we rehearsed my debut, it was the first time I heard my music, learned that I had a fireworks display, or pyro, and came up with some of Kane's most iconic gestures. When I heard my music, I liked it immediately. It was another gem from Jim Johnston, who had created some of the most memorable themes in WWE history. It was dramatic and big, perfect for Kane. I would have different versions of my entrance music over the years, but my favorite was always 2008's Slow Chemical by the band Finger 11. As Taker and I went over what we were going to do, we were told there needed to be a cue for the pyro. It was Taker's idea for me to put my hands up over my head and throw them down quickly to cue the flames. The idea came from Kane simply doing the opposite of Undertaker. If Taker raised his arms to bring the lights up, I would slam my arms down to summon hellfire. Kane was supposed to be a mirror image of Undertaker, so it was perfect. I have to give Taker a lot of credit for that idea and so many others that became integral parts of my career. Though so many fans today associate Bad Blood with my debut, I thought the focus still needed to be on Taker and Shawn's match. They were the main event. I was an added bonus. And in the end, as memorable as it was, I didn't really do much that night. When the lights went down and my music hit, I walked out with Paul Bearer, and Vince, on commentary, gave the iconic line, "That's gotta be Kane." I got a huge pop from the crowd. I ripped the cell door off its hinges, which consisted of me pantomiming shaking it so hard that it seemed locked. I actually lifted the door off its hinges, something we had rehearsed earlier in the day. After I stared down Taker and lowered my arms, the flames shot up and the lights were raised. Then Taker gave me the signal to scoop him up for a tombstone pile driver. If you go back and watch on the WWE Network, you will notice that I turn around a few times before delivering the move to Taker. Looks pretty dramatic, right? It looked like I was parading him around the ring and building the suspense. That's not what I was doing at all. I couldn't remember where the hard camera was. I was literally lost. I just wanted to make sure I was giving the tombstone pile driver from the right angle so it looked good on TV. After all, We didn't go through all this to make it look shoddy. When we got backstage, everyone was happy about how the match and my debut had gone. Vince was sitting just behind the curtain in what we call gorilla position, which back then was just a table and not the more elaborate setup many are familiar with today. He didn't jump up and down in excitement or anything, but I could tell Vince was happy. Bruce was too. Cornette was ecstatic. Everyone felt like we hit a home run. I was happy and relieved. It was so important to me that the fans reacted as they did. Even with all the high fives and excitement backstage, I couldn't help but think about the fact that I had had 2 failed characters before, and I couldn't afford to mess this opportunity up. This was my shot. I couldn't miss. After my debut, I thought, so far so good, and it felt good. Sure, I had had a big match with Bret Hart at SummerSlam 1995, but I had never been invested in the Isaac Yankum character, for good or ill. This was different. I had been nervous walking onto the stage that night in St. Louis because I was putting everything I had into Kane, and the company was investing so heavily in the storyline and in me. Now that it was over, I felt more relief than elation. I had done my part and everything was good. Thank God. But we were just getting started. Monday Night Raw in Kansas City. The thing about sports entertainment is you never have time to breathe and pat yourself on the back. There's always a show tomorrow. Even after any given Wrestlemania is over, Vince never sits back and relishes the moment. He's already getting ready for next year. So I had a great debut. Next. That said, when we got to Monday Night Raw the following night, I got more feedback than I had gotten on Sunday. That was helpful, and I was still feeling good. That Raw in Kansas City proved to be more important than my debut had been, and the Hardy Boys had a lot to do with it. I had met Matt and Jeff Hardy before. They were mostly unknown at this point, having come to WWE from the independent scene doing one-off matches as enhancement for other stars. That's exactly what they were hired to do for me that night. As Matt and Jeff were shown in the ring ready for a tag team match, my music played as Paul and I sauntered into the ring, interrupting them. I knocked Matt out of the ring and threw Jeff on top of him, and the guys really made me look strong. That toss looked good, and Matt and Jeff, who were only in their early 20s at the time, were the reason why. That's when Paul started talking. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me present to you," Paul said to the audience in his hallmark high shrill, "Undertaker's little brother, Kane." The audience roared, and the camera zoomed in on my face. My only job was to look menacing, which wasn't hard to do in that mask, with black makeup around my eyes and my Marilyn Manson contact lens. "Look close, Undertaker," Paul yelled in his twisted, sermonic style. "The whole world saw your face last night when you stood for the first time in 20 years face to face with your own brother. We could all tell by the look in your eyes that you knew it was him." "Yes, he's alive," Paul continued. "Look in his eye, Undertaker. He's missing an eye, and it's your fault. The 20 years of suffering, the 20 years of hiding out is now over, and we have you to thank, Undertaker." The camera zoomed in close so the audience could gaze upon my disturbing-looking eye with the blue contact. "Thanks, JR. Undertaker, this is your stop sign on your highway to eternity," Paul said. "Starting with these boys tonight, we are going to walk through WWE. Take each one, each wrestler, one by one, and destroy them until we beat you. You, Undertaker. That is why Kane is here," Paul declared. "Every time you look around, you're going to see your brother behind you." At that moment, the Raw cameras showed a young man in the audience staring at me. his jaw gaping in seeming disbelief at what he was witnessing. Another fan held a sign in the crowd that read, "Kane," spelled C-A-I-N, "lives, dead man," indicating that not only was Kane, spelled K-A-N-E, getting over with the crowd, but that my character was so new that some didn't know how to spell my name yet. It was working. "Every time you close your eyes to go to sleep," Paul said to Undertaker, wherever he was, "you're going to remember that terrible night. The fire. Oh, yes, the fire. Undertaker, welcome to your worst nightmare." Paul finished, and my music hit. "This man is a monster. A monster," JR bellowed from the announcer's desk. It was perfect. Path of destruction. When Paul said I was going to walk through WWE, picking off wrestlers one by one until I got my revenge on Undertaker, he wasn't kidding. For the next 6 months, that was exactly the plan. And it proved key to establishing Kane as a monster heel. Jim Cornette told me at the time that I had the best spot in the company because I was going to destroy every babyface on the roster, except Steve Austin and, of course, Undertaker. Road Warrior Hawk, Ahmed Johnson, Flash Funk, Crush, Dude Love, another one of Mick Foley's personas, a fun-loving hippie. I demolished all of them, with Paul cutting blistering promos every time. Those few months were some of the absolute greatest for me as Kane. I remember appearing on a nationally televised daytime program with other WWE superstars and being asked what my thoughts were on 1997. I replied that it was the best year ever because I had destroyed everyone. Kane was getting over, and it was thanks, in no small part, to the many already established stars who had no problem getting beaten by the former Isaac Yankum and Fake Diesel, who was finally on his way to becoming a star in his own right. I appreciated every single one of them, more than they know. I thank them all just as heartily and humbly today. They did an immeasurable favor for a guy who had been in the business a while, but really needed a big breakthrough. Thanks to them, I was finally getting it. I remember when I was working in Smoky Mountain, Al Snow once said, "You know who the most powerful man in WWE is? Barry Horowitz." For years, Horowitz worked for WWE as an enhancement talent, meaning that his job was to make our biggest superstars look good in the ring without any expectation of becoming more high profile himself within the company. Al basically said that if Undertaker gave Barry a tombstone piledriver, the most destructive move in WWE, and Horowitz sold it, everyone would buy into what just happened. On the other hand, if Taker were to give Barry his most brutal finisher, and Horowitz simply got up, brushed off his head like nothing happened, and jumped over the top rope to scurry off, everyone would think Undertaker was a fraud and incompetent. If Barry didn't do his job, no one would believe that Undertaker was a force to be reckoned with. Al was right. Being a big star in WWE is the goal for so many, but it's the people who make the star shine who are most important. That's what so many of my friends and colleagues did for me between October 1997 and April the following year, and I will be eternally grateful to them for their help. Riding with Paul Bearer. As my star rose, Paul Bearer and I started traveling together. Since no one was supposed to know what I looked like, I would often wear a ski mask or put a towel over my head while riding in the car with Paul, especially at night when entering the arenas. I'll never forget pulling into the San Diego Sports Arena, which was then called the Valley View Casino Center, at a time when WWE was getting super hot. Steve Austin was then the biggest thing in sports entertainment, beginning to achieve mainstream popularity not seen in our business since Hulk Hogan. And The Rock, aka Dwayne Johnson, was right on his heels, about to take off into superstardom. That day in San Diego, under the ramp where we pulled into the arena, at least 5,000 fans stood lined up to catch a glimpse of their favorite superstar. Think about it. That's 5,000 fans just hanging around outside. The show wouldn't start for hours. On that particular night, Paul told me he wasn't feeling well and asked me to drive. We had rented a red Cadillac, not the most inconspicuous car to carry a mysterious masked superstar. Paul was hunkered down next to me, looking sick. But as I pulled into the arena wearing a ski mask, let that scene sink in for a moment. Paul jerked to life, rolled down his window, and screamed to the thousands of waiting fans, "It's a miracle! Kane can drive! Kane can drive!" He got me. I had to laugh. Another time, we landed in Los Angeles for a show in Anaheim. Paul was dying to go to El Torito, a Mexican restaurant that was also in Anaheim. I needed to go to the gym and had always visited the original Gold's Gym in Venice Beach when I was in the area. I got to the gym, but afterwards, traffic was so terrible, remember, we're in LA, that there was no way we were going to be able to make it to the restaurant. Paul was so mad he didn't talk to me for 2 days. After that, we had a show in Salt Lake City, and Paul still wasn't talking to me. Later that night, we went to a nice steakhouse with our friends, Phineas I and Henry O. Godwin, the ring names for a WWE tag team. I picked up the check. Paul thought that was the greatest thing ever, and the El Torito incident was forgotten. During that time, we often traveled with Scotty Taylor, aka Scotty Too Hottie, of the soon-to-be popular tag team Too Cool. Paul and I would share driving duties, and Scotty, who wasn't old enough to rent a car, would sit in the back by himself. Paul was one of the sweetest men I have ever known. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2013 at age 58. It was an honor to induct him into the WWE Hall of Fame the following year. Though times could be tough, Paul had a heart of gold. He took care of everything. In WWE, the company booked your flights, but talent had to take care of the rest, including hotels and car rentals. Paul booked all of it. He took care of us. I'll never forget it. And I will never forget my friend, who had as much to do with the success of Kane as anyone. Survivor Series in Montreal. Yes, that one. My first actual match as Kane, as opposed to just showing up everywhere and annihilating everyone in my path, was with Mankind at Survivor Series 1997. Yes, at the infamous Montreal Screwjob pay-per-view. We'll get to that. Mick Foley, as Dude Love, had been one of Kane's many victims in recent months. But here Mick was returning as his much darker Mankind character. What I remember most about the match, even more than winning, was how we got to the finish. I threw Mankind off the top turnbuckle, slamming him hard onto the outside floor. It was brutal. Mick had asked me to do it beforehand. He was doing crazy stuff long before the famous fall from the top of Hell in a Cell the following year at the hands of Undertaker. Mick was always trying to outdo himself with bigger and more spectacular stunts. Our match that night was no exception. Vince didn't want Kane and Taker on the same show, so Mark didn't have a match that night. But Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels did. Like most of the locker room, Paul and I had absolutely no idea what was about to go down. For those unfamiliar with this piece of sports entertainment lore, Bret was leaving WWE to join Ted Turner's rival World Championship Wrestling, WCW, which had been beating WWE in television ratings. Despite WWE's exploding popularity during this time, we would not surpass WCW in ratings for another 5 months. This colossal, years-long battle between these two sports entertainment powerhouses is remembered today as the Monday Night War. As the Canadian hero, Bret did not want to lose the title in his home country. So that night, Vince, in what would end up becoming the origin of his Mr. McMahon character, called for the bell prematurely, thereby awarding Shawn the victory, even though Bret had never submitted. When the hastened finish came, with Shawn putting Bret in Bret's own signature submission hold, called the sharpshooter, and referee Earl Hebner yelling, "Ring the bell," we still didn't know what to think. Bret was going nuts, of course. Shawn had left with the WWE Championship. Among the many of us who were watching backstage, the general feeling was, what the heck was that? Was it part of the storyline? Did Bret actually get screwed? We really didn't know what to think. As Paul and I headed to our car, we saw Earl and his brother Dave Hebner in a big hurry to get out of there. They hadn't even bothered changing their clothes, which was unusual. I ended up talking to Mick about it backstage. He was upset and said he was going to quit. In the hotel room later, Mick got a call from Vince and hung up on him. Mick would not take Vince's call. I was like, dude, what are you doing? I told him he should calm down and really think this through. Mick did not show up for TV the next day. I also don't remember Davey Boy Smith or Owen Hart being at the television taping. I remember we were in some little town outside Montreal, and Vince came walking in with a black eye. He explained his side of things. He said he had tried to work with Bret the best he could, but his world champion still refused to drop the title in Canada, despite the fact that he was going to WCW. Though it's complicated, I ultimately side with Vince in his decision that night. Many look at the Monday Night War as an awesome time in the sports entertainment business. It was. It was also a very stressful time. People were afraid for their jobs. In the end, this is still a business. Vince did what was right for business. As I understand it, after WCW offered Bret a big money contract, Vince countered with his own attractive long-term deal. Vince should probably have never countered. He should have let Bret go to WCW right then and there. Because later, when Vince told Bret he wanted out of their contract and encouraged him to see if he could still make some good money with WCW, it was just too convoluted. But the real reason Vince was ultimately right had nothing to do with titles, or his ego, or how he felt about Bret, or Shawn, or any of the other things people have speculated over the last 2 decades. Vince had to protect his product because he had to protect us. As much as himself, his company, and his family, he was looking out for everyone on his roster and their families. We were in an all-out war with another major pro wrestling company, and it was highly likely one side was eventually going to win. One eventually did. On a lighter note, it was during WWE's jaunt through Canada that winter that I began doing the head tilt gimmick that would become an enduring part of the Kane character. Ottawa was the first place I tried it, tilting my head slightly to the side in an almost understated way while looking at my opponent or into the camera. It always got a great reaction. Bruce Pritchard, who had been so instrumental in my character's initial development, said I got more emotion from the crowd with that one simple move than I could with a fiery promo. Over the years, many have assumed the head tilt must have come from some deep, dark place in Kane's demonic mind. Nope. It came from my St. Bernard, Annie. She would always tilt her head when I said her name. Tormenting the dead man. After my rivalry with Mankind, I moved on to Vader. Vader was the real deal. A 350-pounder who could do moonsaults, a flipping move off the turnbuckle normally reserved for cruiserweights. No one had ever seen anything like him. When wrestlers start a match, they typically start with the light stuff and move into the heavier moves as things progress. Not Leon, or at least not with me. Every match, he would begin by punching me in the face, really hard. Then I would legit punch him back in the face, really hard. We did that every night. Pay-per-views, television tapings, house shows, it didn't matter. It was like he gave me that first punch to see what I was going to do, while I was thinking, why do we have to do this every time? Leon was another good guy who helped forge Kane's path. I'm sorry that he's not still with us today. Sadly, he died in June of 2018 after a long struggle with heart problems. The sole purpose of my program with Vader was to continue building me up before my eventual showdown with Undertaker. But before that would happen, Mark and I still had plenty of storytelling to do. During this time, I was laying waste to the biggest baby faces on the roster. I would interrupt Undertaker during his matches and promos, but we never touched. This was important. It built anticipation. It was all about intimidation and mind games. The idea was that we would constantly interact, but never really fight. A lot of these angles had to do with Taker refusing to fight me, his estranged little brother. At a December Raw in 1997, Paul and I interrupted Undertaker yet again. I slapped Mark. I tried to slap him again, but he blocked me. Instead of retaliating, he just walked to the back. It was a great angle, but it bothered me. Even though the storyline was going really well and helping both of us, I didn't feel right going out there and just slapping Undertaker. Who does that? Taker is the most respected person in the WWE locker room, and you can put me at the top of his list of admirers. Before we went out to the ring that night, I walked up to Mark and told him he needed to slap me right there. He was like, "Are you serious?" He insisted it wasn't a big deal. I said it was to me. So he slapped me really hard. My immediate thought was, why did I ask him to slap me? And then, I'm going to slap the snot out of him next time we're out there. What's that old saying about being careful what you wish for? In the ring and in promos, everything I did was done with the intention of goading Taker into fighting me. We did a segment on Raw where Taker stood in the ring, threatening me in an interview. Then Paul and I popped up on the Titantron. We were standing in the graveyard where Taker's parents and mine were buried. Paul reminded Taker in every interview that it was his fault they had perished in the house fire he allegedly started, and that Undertaker had murdered his own parents. Paul then handed me a sledgehammer, and I smashed the 2 headstones before us. "That's his own mother and father's gravesite," JR screamed to the Raw audience. "He's desecrating his own parents' grave." Then I set the graves on fire. Undertaker looked on, enraged but motionless and silent. Then Raw went dark and bled into a commercial break. It was another perfect chapter in our ongoing saga, but I remember it for other reasons. Some people think WWE superstars lead glamorous and exciting lives. In many ways, that's true. But during the day-to-day routine, more often than not, it doesn't feel that way. The day of the graveyard scene on Raw, Paul and I had to wake in at 5 a.m. in Syracuse, New York, where the show is happening, to catch a flight to New York and then drive to Stamford, Connecticut to shoot the segment. Yes, for those unaware, Undertaker's parents and mine were buried at the TV studios of WWE headquarters. After we finished, we flew back to Syracuse because Paul and I were booked to walk out during the dark match, in wrestling parlance, an untelevised match, after Raw went off the air that night. WWE superstars' schedules are grueling. Sometimes I don't know how we did it. One Raw during this time has always stuck out in my mind. Paul and I were shown backstage wheeling around a dirty casket. Paul was a huge country music fan, probably the biggest George Jones fan on the planet, and so, appropriately, the camera showed him singing the Randy Travis hit, Digging Up Bones, as he pushed a deteriorated carcass toward the main stage. I wonder if non-WWE fans flipping through their channels that night came across this scene and thought, what in the world is on my TV? But that was the tame part. Soon, we would reveal that these were our parents' caskets, Taker's and mine, which Paul and I had just dug up 20 years after they had been buried. I set my father's casket on fire, and when an angry Undertaker rushed me, I chokeslammed him through our mother's casket. Close-up shots showed a decimated Taker lying amid the broken wood. Others showed our mother's bones. Worms could be seen crawling through the dirt and other remains. Again, it was classic Kane terrorizing Undertaker. High-level storytelling. Anyone unfamiliar with sports entertainment would have thought we were absolutely nuts. The WWE Universe ate it up. I could write an entire chapter on everyone I chokeslammed over the years, even leaving out actual superstars. I chokeslammed a priest, the Easter Bunny, and even the Phoenix Suns mascot, a gorilla. I remember Paul telling me that beating up a guy in a gorilla costume was too much ha-ha. Paul felt it was a comedy skit that would hurt Kane's dark persona. I was like, am I really doing this? I talked to Bruce Pritchard, and he said it was definitely happening. The hoped-for payoff for the Phoenix Suns gorilla spot was that it would be replayed on ESPN SportsCenter. That was a gamble because some of the producers at ESPN didn't like WWE, even though others were huge fans. That night, the producers must have been fans because SportsCenter showed me chokeslamming the Suns gorilla. Then there was Pete Rose. Pete Rose had it coming. I am certain that if Pete Rose hadn't pursued a career in baseball, he would have been a great wrestling heel. One of Kane's most iconic moments occurred in 1998 at WrestleMania 14 in Boston, prior to my match with Undertaker, when I delivered a patented tombstone piledriver to the guest ring announcer, Major League Baseball's all-time hit king, Pete Rose. I learned about the bit with Pete the day of the show. That often happens in WWE. Some things are planned for months, but so much of the good stuff is the result of last-second inspiration. Pete and I went over the tombstone, but I didn't know what he was going to say when introducing me or any other details. I'm glad I didn't, because Pete Rose was pure magic on the microphone, and my reactions to his banner must have been persuasive because they were authentic. Being a St. Louis Cardinals baseball fan, I reserve a dark corner of my heart for hatred of the New York Mets. When I was growing up, the phrase, "the Mets are pond scum," had crept into the patois of Cardinals fans. We didn't appreciate Pete Rose much either. Charlie Hustle was one of those guys you loved when he played for your team, but you loved to hate when he played for your opponents. In 1986, the World Series featured the Mets versus the Boston Red Sox. In the 10th inning of Game 6, Red Sox great Bill Buckner committed one of the most famous errors in baseball history, allowing the Mets to win the game and eventually the series. 12 years later, Pete Rose was standing in a WWE ring in the middle of Boston's Fleet Center with the microphone in his hand. "I left some tickets for Bill Buckner, but he couldn't bend over to pick them up," Pete said, finishing with a gratuitous, "How about it?" The crowd booed Pete out of the building. I arrived in the ring with Paul Bearer, walked up to Pete, grabbed him by the throat, and hoisted him onto my shoulder before dropping him on his head. The crowd went crazy as Pete was taken out of the ring and to the back on a stretcher. My next encounter with Pete was in Philadelphia the following year at WrestleMania 15. As I made my way to the ring for my match against Triple H, the world-famous San Diego Chicken made its WrestleMania debut, attacking me from behind. I grabbed the mascot and pulled off its head, revealing a stunned and defeated Hit King. Same result. I dropped Pete on his head. The only difference was this time he was wearing a chicken outfit instead of a tuxedo. Next year was WrestleMania 2000 in Anaheim, California. I had been involved in a fierce rivalry with my former tag team partner X-Pac, leading to a tag match between X-Pac and his D-Generation X stablemate Road Dogg against Rikishi and me. Rikishi was a unique character, a cross between a sumo wrestler and a hip-hop artist. During that time, he was always joined in the ring after a match by his associates, the tag team Too Cool, Scotty 2 Hotty, and Grandmaster Sexay. The house lights would dim and be replaced with disco balls. The music hit, and the three of them would delight the audience with their dance routine. For a reason known only to the wrestling gods, after our tag match at WrestleMania 2000, during which we beat X-Pac and Road Dogg, the San Diego Chicken suddenly appeared in the ring to join Rikishi and Too Cool in their post-match celebration. Because it was obvious that Pete Rose was going back to the same ill-fated tricks, I snatched that chicken by his beak. But the man in the chicken suit was not Pete. The ruse worked. As I struggled to unmask the chicken, Pete slid in the ring behind me, armed with a baseball bat. Throughout his career, Pete had been known as a singles hitter, but that night, he was winding up for a home run. Luckily, Rikishi grabbed the bat out of Pete's hands. I followed with the chokeslam. Rikishi finished off the Hit King with his patented stink face. The stink face is what Rikishi gave WWE superstars when they found themselves slumped down on the mat with their backs and heads against the second turnbuckle. Rikishi would stick his bulbous derriere right in their faces, traumatizing them. In my experience, Pete Rose was always a trooper, a showman, and a professional. He understood WWE is entertainment and wanted to put on a good show, even when he was the butt of the joke. After our encounter at WrestleMania 2000, Pete caught up with me backstage. He handed me the bat he had brought to the ring. It was signed Pete Rose, Hit King, 4,256. That bat is one of my most prized possessions. In 2004, I had the honor of inducting Pete Rose into the celebrity wing of the WWE Hall of Fame. While the debate rages on whether Rose belongs in baseball's Hall of Fame, Pete's iconic moments at WrestleMania assured him a place in WWE's. And to all those Cardinals baseball fans who love to hate Pete, those tombstones were for you. Kane and Undertaker get superpowers. They needed to find different ways for Taker and me to continue our rivalry until our eventual WrestleMania showdown, while keeping us apart physically, or at least not beating each other up for too long on any given segment. So, they decided to give us superpowers. One night on Raw, Paul and I entered the ring to intimidate Undertaker and everyone else by revealing my secret powers. "Show them what you can do," Paul commanded. I shot lightning bolts toward Jim Ross and Michael Cole's announcer's desk. "How do you like that, leeches of the night?" Paul screamed. "That damn spotlight has been in my eyes all night, Kane," Paul said to me, pointing at the lighting rig. "Kill it," he demanded. I moved my arm and fist, which made the spotlight explode and the crew member running it slump over in his perch high above the arena. Paul then told me, basically, to do whatever I wanted to do with my powers. So I shot lightning through my hands at a crew member wandering near the bottom of the entrance ramp. He ran backstage, engulfed in flames. "Burn, baby, burn," Paul cackled. While the audience in the arena saw the explosions and the fire, No one in attendance could see the lightning bolts. That spectacle was just for the audience at home. Remember, this was 1997. Still, WWE's production expertise was ahead of its time, and we could superimpose lightning onto the screen in real time. It was amazing. WWE was second to none in its technological capabilities compared to most others in television. Once, when visiting our satellite truck, team members told me that their editing and rendering capabilities far surpassed those of CNN. They said that we could do things even major cable news outlets couldn't do at the time. And let's face it, no other characters in WWE could have pulled off possessing such fantastical powers except the Big Red Machine and the Dead Man. This was our own unique territory, and we exploited it to create some of the most memorable moments of the Attitude Era. It simply wouldn't have worked with anyone else. The last Raw before the Royal Rumble in State College, Pennsylvania. On the Monday Night Raw, prior to the Royal Rumble 1998, Shawn Michaels was advertised as having a big announcement. He invited Kane to join D-Generation X. Everybody saw last week, Shawn began his invitation to me on Raw. Paul Bearer and Kane have split ways. We had had a minor tiff. And Kane has wandered out into the world alone. D-Generation X would be glad to stand here, open arms, like the family Kane never had, and accept him into our family of D-Generation X. Ladies and gentlemen, the newest member of D-Generation X, Kane, Shawn announced, pointing to the entrance curtain. That's when Undertaker's music hit. After his entrance, Taker entered the ring, surrounded by DX, and told Shawn point blank, "Now, Michaels, I would appreciate it if you left my family out of this. This has nothing to do with my little brother, Kane." Now, let's make one thing clear. Taker had a point here. While I had been terrorizing my older brother for months, this did not mean Kane was necessarily a fan of D-Generation X. The Big Red Machine wasn't really a big fan of anyone, except maybe Paul Bearer, and even that was questionable. "If I was you," Taker said to Shawn, "I'd be worried about the Royal Rumble, the WWE title, and the Undertaker punching about a 6-inch hole right in the middle of your forehead." That's when Undertaker grabbed Shawn by the neck. Then he let him go to turn around and grab Chyna by the neck. That was really one of the first times Chyna was made to look vulnerable. Triple H then cracked a crutch across Undertaker's back and ran away as HBK, Shawn Michaels, aka Heartbreak Kid, or HBK, surprised Mark with his trademark super kick to the chin. Taker was laid out as Shawn kept walloping him with the crutch, and D-Generation X ganged up on the Dead Man. That's when the chants started. "We want Kane. We want Kane." I could hear the crowd backstage and immediately got goosebumps. 15,000 people. They kept getting louder. I thought to myself, echoing a chant more popular in today's WWE, "This is awesome." That's when the lights went down. My music hit, and I walked through the curtain. The crowd erupted. It was time to take care of business. "He'll walk right through hell. He's Kane," JR screamed. "The question is he coming to assist DX or to dismantle them?" Jerry Lawler kept saying he was sure I was there to help D-Generation X and maybe even join them as a new member. At this time, D-Generation X members included Shawn, Triple H, and Chyna. But no, I didn't want to join them. Instead, I snatched Shawn by the hair to stop him from punching Taker, which he had done repeatedly. The audience went bonkers. Triple H hit me in the back with his crutch to draw me away from destroying Shawn. Then Hunter ran like a coward. All of DX did. "Nobody wants any part of Kane," JR yelled. "Kane has come to help his brother." I chased D-Generation X to the back and turned around at the top of the ramp to stare at Taker, who was still stumbling around in the ring due to the beatdown he had just received. He finally gathered his wits and stopped dead in his tracks. He stared right back at me. I extended my hand from a distance, the camera catching the perfect side profile of the Big Red Machine, who appeared to be presenting a peace offering to the dead man. The audience was on their feet. They loved every minute of it. Kane is apparently extending his hand in some sort of bond of friendship, JR said, and Undertaker is returning it. Jim said this as Taker dropped to one knee and threw his head back as his eyes rolled backward into his skull, extending his hand right back at me. "Oh, what a moment," JR wailed. Undertaker seemed as if he had a smile on his face. Note, Undertaker never has a smile on his face. This was more like mafia members kissing the Godfather's ring, the ring of death. The Brothers of Destruction would not come until later, but we planted the seed for the first time that night. It was magic, and the WWE Universe couldn't wait. Royal Rumble in San Antonio. The Royal Rumble is one of the most popular WWE pay-per-views, not only because of the Rumble itself, which is always exciting, but because it has long been the most crucial event in setting up or cementing storylines that will come to a grand finale at Wrestlemania. January 1998 was no different. Stone Cold Steve Austin would win the Rumble that year by throwing out The Rock as his last competitor in the ring, but the main event was the WWE Champion, Shawn Michaels, versus Undertaker in a casket match. And you know that, just as had occurred in their inaugural Hell in a Cell match 3 months prior, Kane was going to be a big part of this show too. Shawn and Mark had a great match, as usual, one that ended with HBK keeping the WWE title because D-Generation X hit the ring to gang up on Undertaker. The last time Undertaker lost a casket match, his trademark match, had been 4 years prior against Yokozuna at Royal Rumble 1994. Now, he was being beat down gang style by a bunch of degenerates. It was time for Kane to break it down. My music hit. Kane's fiery sonic boom pierced the arena. My flames burst upward, and I rolled into the ring like a tank, ready to take out every last member of D-Generation X. Kane had come to save Undertaker. "There he is," shouted JR. "This unholy alliance of these brothers of the night, Kane is coming to help his brother." "Sorry, JR, not happening." A dazed Undertaker staggered before me, and I elbowed him hard in the face. "Come on," JR screamed. "No, damn it." I kept pounding away on Mark. "Kane is assaulting his brother," Jim said with torturous disappointment. That's when Paul Bearer started walking down. I threw Taker into the casket, and DX's Shawn and Hunter slammed the door shut. That's how Shawn, technically, won the match and kept his WWE title. Paul and I began putting padlocks on the casket, making sure there was no way Undertaker could escape. We began rolling an entombed Taker up the entrance ramp. I pulled out an axe and started chopping away at the top of the casket, piercing it while Undertaker was still lying inside it. It was a brutal spectacle. "This is hideous," JR yelled. "This is nothing but carnage." Then I doused the entire casket in gasoline. Paul lit the match, and we both set Undertaker ablaze while he was still trapped inside. I dropped down to one knee, just like Undertaker, and extended my hand upward, summoning hell as the flames engulfed the casket. "The casket is on fire," JR cried out. "Undertaker is in the casket." No one saw Undertaker again until right before WrestleMania, 3 months later. Kane versus Undertaker at WrestleMania 14. "Kane!" Undertaker thundered on Monday Night Raw 2 weeks before what would prove to be the biggest match of my career to date. At WrestleMania 14, I will strike down upon thee with anger and furious vengeance, Taker said, standing on top of the Titantron and looking down on me in the ring. I will deliver you to the fiery pits of eternal damnation, he warned. You will know my name as the Lord of Darkness, Taker continued. Little brother, I've felt your wrath. Now you're gonna feel mine. It's too late to turn back, Taker said. The only thing that you can do now is rest in peace. With that, a bolt of lightning came from the sky, for home viewers at least, setting a statue of me on fire. Undertaker had burned Kane in effigy. Despite the cool build-up to WrestleMania, a lot of it was a blur to me until the event. What I do remember vividly is constantly thinking about how far I had come. I had gone from being an evil dentist relegated mostly to the mid-card to a star in one of the most high-profile matches at WrestleMania that year. We were on the same card with Shawn Michaels versus Stone Cold Steve Austin for the WWE Championship, with Mike Tyson as the special guest enforcer. It doesn't get any bigger than that. We were in Boston, and I remember taking a carriage ride the night before with Crystal and just sort of soaking it all in. On the day of WrestleMania, most of the performers get there early and rehearse. Mark and I didn't do that. The night before, I went to Taker's hotel room and we went over the match. He wanted to lay it out like the famous Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman rope-a-dope match at the Rumble in the Jungle in Kinshasa, Zaire in 1974. Many years later, Foreman famously laughed about the contest, saying that he had been the dope because Ali had caused Foreman to exhaust himself by throwing barrages of ineffective punches so that he was virtually defenseless by the time Ali moved in for the knockout punch. I dominated Taker for the majority of the match. I even pinned Mark, and right before the 3 count, jerked him up by his hair to stop him from being beat. One of Taker's most memorable comeback attempts during my onslaught was when he went flying over the top and crashed down on the announcer's table, flattening it. I took advantage of that too. I was taking him apart, piece by piece, for almost the entire match. Like Ali and Foreman, it was a massacre. Until it wasn't. Now at this point, no one had kicked out of Undertaker's tombstone piledriver, except maybe Hulk Hogan. But as far as the audience that night was concerned, it had never been done. As Mark began his comeback, JR said, "Maybe the rope-a-dope has taken its toll on Kane." Nice one, JR. When he laid me out with the tombstone and I kicked out, the crowd was shocked. No one believed it. "Oh, God," JR screamed. "Nobody's ever done that. Nobody's ever kicked out of the Undertaker's tombstone." After I did a ramrod straight sit-up, deadman style, and walked right back almost zombie-like into a waiting Taker, I got another tombstone. "Well, this has gotta be it," JR screamed. "Kane kicked out," JR exclaimed. "Good Lord." No one could believe it. The little brother of The Undertaker had not only survived the tombstone piledriver, but had done so twice. After I popped out of the second tombstone, Paul Bearer was on the outside acting like he was having a heart attack, and the audience was on their feet, not sure of what might come next. We had taken the match into uncharted territory, which had been the idea all along. Taker clotheslined me from the top turnbuckle, from which I also sat up almost immediately, again, just like Undertaker would. "Look at Kane sit right up," JR said. "It's amazing." That's when he delivered the third tombstone piledriver. The crowd watched the 1, 2, 3. Many, no doubt, expecting me to pop my shoulder up again. I popped out, but it was after the 3 count was over. So close. I had lost, but barely. After I was pinned, Paul threw a steel chair into the ring and tried to get some licks in on Taker before Bearer was pushed to the ground. Then I delivered a post-match tombstone to Taker on the steel chair. "I've seen war on small countries with less intensity than this," JR yelled. Even in my defeat, Kane was still being portrayed as an unstoppable force. That was all Mark and his influence. He didn't have to do that. He could have buried me at WrestleMania if he wanted to. After all, that's where storylines are supposed to reach their ultimate climax and conclusion. But Mark was wise enough to know that, while he had to win the match, it was smart business to get as much mileage out of the Kane character as possible, which would lead to one of the craziest matches I've ever had. The first Inferno match. After WrestleMania, the Taker-Kane rivalry was so hot that WWE decided to literally turn up the heat with the first ever Inferno match, which was set to take place at Unforgiven 1998. The idea was that flames would somehow engulf the ring, but instead of the ropes being on fire, an apparatus surrounding the ring would shoot flames into the air. The pay-per-view event would take place in Greensboro, North Carolina, but we had a show the night before in Fayetteville. The plan was for Paul and me to fly into Greensboro, drive nearly 100 miles to Fayetteville, and then back to Greensboro to rehearse the match. WWE had a car take us, and it was an experience I will never forget. As Paul and I waited, up pulled a limousine. I use the term loosely. It was all beaten up. The windows didn't work. When we went to a drive-thru to get something to eat, we had to open the doors to get our food. The trip was in progress as Paul and I fell asleep, waking up just as we were pulling into the Fayetteville arena. But there was just one problem. We weren't in Fayetteville. The driver had driven the wrong way. Remember, we had no GPS or cell phone in those days. Paul called the office from a gas station payphone. Now, instead of being just 2 hours from Fayetteville, we were 4 hours away. The office said we still had to go to Fayetteville because Undertaker and other stars who had been advertised for the event would not be appearing. My match in Fayetteville was against Vader, and it was one of the quickest matches I ever had. Here's how it went down. Paul and I drove the 4 hours back to Greensboro, and then on another 2 hours to Fayetteville. I was still dressing in the car when we pulled up to the arena at 10:30 p.m. I jumped out of the car and immediately began my match with Vader. We fought to the ring, into the ring, out of the ring, and then back to the locker room. I jumped right back in the car to head to Greensboro. I might have been in the arena 5 minutes, and I don't think Paul even got out of the car. Now, we were driving back to Greensboro, and I was changing in the car again. Then, about 1 a.m., after all our rushing around, we found out there would be no rehearsal that night because it was too late. One day in the life of a WWE superstar. The next day, we had the actual rehearsal for the Inferno match. I'll never forget that either. As we went over the match, the stunt crew was explaining to me how my arm was going to catch fire that night. We would use a special suit designed specifically for that match. The arm of my suit was removable, fastened on with Velcro. For the finish, I would be knocked out of the ring. Then Vader would come down to fight me. Then Undertaker would jump on both of us. This would leave me lying on the ground at ringside, which was key. A band had performed on the pay-per-view earlier. Taker chased Paul Bearer to the top of the entrance ramp, where the band equipment was, and began mauling him, smashing him with the bass drum. That spot looked really cool. But what Paul and Taker were really doing was distracting the audience away from me. During their melee, I had rolled under the ring to prepare the burn stunt. I climbed under the ring until it covered my torso. Then I pulled off the suit sleeve, and members of the production crew helped me replace it with one made of flame retardant material. Then they applied cooling gel with an accelerant that burned at a low temperature. Keep in mind that the low temperature was still a couple hundred degrees. After Taker finished beating up Paul with the band's drum set, cutting him on his head, Mark came back to take care of me. Undertaker knocked me into the flames at ringside, and while I was pantomiming my gimmicked arm going into the flames, my other arm touched the burner. It was like touching a hot stove. As my arm caught fire, I had to remember everything they had told me to do. I had to keep my arms away from my face and make sure my face was turned away so I did not inhale the flames. As I ran up the ramp at the end of the match, it was important that the flames trailed me, or the rest of my suit could catch fire. It was unnerving. The crew had said that the moment I felt any tingling or any heat at all, I needed to cue them by falling down so they could spray me with fire extinguishers. They made one thing clear. My failure to follow these directions could result in my being badly burned. So, on top of the pressure of having to perform for thousands of spectators in the arena and for millions more who are watching on pay-per-view, I had to worry about avoiding third-degree burns. Luckily, the match unfolded as planned, and at the end, I ran to the back with my arm ablaze. It was quite a spectacle, which was the entire idea. Undertaker had won the match by setting his little brother on fire. In my current role as mayor, people often ask me, what's harder, politics or WWE? That night, it was WWE for sure. Although I've taken some heat in politics, I have never burnt myself to a crisp as I almost did at Unforgiven. In terms of action, this was one of the best matches we had. But in terms of psychology, it was hard to pull off. The winner of the match did so by putting his opponent in the fire. But although the stunt crew had coated both of us with flame retardant chemicals, which is especially important for two guys with long and flammable hair, it was so hot when we approached the flames that neither of us got close enough to look like we were in any real danger. So in addition to trying to have a quality match, each of us faced a significant element of physical risk. We were literally trying not to get burned alive. It was a unique match, unlike any other in WWE history. But it wasn't just the match that I remember vividly. One of the things I remember most that day happened at rehearsal. The stunt crew WWE brought in was from Hollywood. They were professionals responsible for creating some of the most exciting scenes in our favorite movies. I was talking with some of the guys in the parking lot outside the Greensboro Coliseum, and one guy asked, "So, you guys are going to do this real time tonight?" I said, "Yes." He said, "A stunt like this in Hollywood would usually take us about a week to set up." How comforting. WWE is unlike any other business. When we're in the ring performing, we're not always just thinking about the match. We're thinking about the promo afterward, where this story might go, and how we arrive at this point. Some of us are thinking about how not to get burnt to a crisp. Professional wrestling is a sport, but it's unlike any other sport in the world. If you play football or basketball or any other professional sport, your mind is focused solely on the game. That's what you're expected to concentrate on. In WWE, our minds could be on a million things in addition to the match we're having. Wrestling and acting can be contrasted the same way. Professional Hollywood actors rehearse scenes and might do multiple takes before moving on to the next one. If they need dialogue in a fight scene, they can shoot it separately. It can all be edited or spliced together. Wrestling, it's not like that. 1 second you're talking, and the next you're fighting. Maybe you're doing both simultaneously. You constantly have to be mentally prepared to multitask in this unique, hybrid business of acting and athletics. All of these roles, athlete, actor, even stuntman, were in play during our Inferno match. That night, we had to do something neither Mark nor I had ever done before, all in one long shot, without it looking cheesy and without either of us getting hurt. And it had to be good. In the end, we were both proud of what we had accomplished that night. I do remember during a surreal moment in that match, I looked down at my arm and thought, wow, I'm on fire. Only in WWE. Kane versus Stone Cold Steve Austin at King of the Ring. After Unforgiven, I was still in the mix with all the top stars in the company, including Undertaker and Mick Foley. But my next pay-per-view match would be against the biggest WWE superstar of them all, Stone Cold Steve Austin. At that time, there was no one in sports entertainment more popular anywhere in the world than Austin. His rivalry with Mr. McMahon had taken the industry to heights no one could have predicted just a few years earlier. His signature 316 t-shirts, which paraphrased a quotation of John 3:16 from the Bible to say, Austin 3:16 says I just whipped your ass, were outselling Michael Jordan's and NASCAR's. Steve had become a mainstream pop culture icon. And that summer, I was right in the middle of it. At King of the Ring, Steve and I were to engage in a first blood match for the WWE Championship. The first person to bleed would lose the match. Obviously, as the heel in that match, my suit and mask would give me a clear advantage. But before we got there, Austin had to accept my challenge. That would happen in Austin, Texas, on the Raw before the pay-per-view. I've bled before, I ain't afraid to bleed again, Austin said in the middle of the ring that night, thus accepting the stipulation. Austin made it clear, however, that with the title on the line, the match was going to be a war. The crowd went nuts. Let me tell you something, Steve continued. You say that if you don't win the WWE title, you'll set yourself on fire. I'll tell you something right now. You can bet your bottom dollar that Stone Cold Steve Austin is going to bring all the marshmallows, all the hot dogs, and all the beer. The crowd roared again. It doesn't matter to me, Austin said. You can be the human campfire, and I'll sit there and watch you burn all day long. And if you start to go out, you can rest assured that old Stone Cold will be there to throw another log on the fire. The audience went wild, and that's when my explosions went off. Flames shot up, and I walked to the stage. Austin and I stared each other down. I tilted my head. He did not flinch. Then I raised my arms, and bam! Fake blood poured down all over Steve's head. It was just like the famous scene from the movie Carrie, which was the idea. Austin was wearing a bright white 316 baseball shirt for dramatic effect. The world title in his hand was drenched. Kane had started using a voice box to speak during this rivalry. As a shocked and blood-soaked Austin looked at me, I put my voice box up to my neck and spoke. Austin, this Sunday, the blood on you will be for real, I said in a creepy electronic vibrato. The crowd went silent for a moment, digesting what had just happened. Then they erupted, knowing that Austin would get his payback at King of the Ring. We had the audience. It was perfect. Well, almost. With the voice box, it was hard for me to find the right balance between using my actual voice, where you could understand me on the mic, yet still retain the vibrato effect that made me sound spooky and weird. Just before this segment, the first time we used the voice gimmick in a show, Jim Cornette found me and asked, "Did you rehearse the voice box?" I said no. Cornette was like, "Oh man, someone's going to be in trouble." He said we were supposed to rehearse because no one had any idea how the voice box would sound on the mic. When I got backstage that night, we had to re-record the audio so the fans at home could understand what I had said. Our segment ended raw. It was the perfect lead-in to Kane and Austin's match, King of the Ring. Every fan remembers King of the Ring 1998, right? Of course you do. It was the night Mankind fought Undertaker in Hell in a Cell. I'm still hot at Mick Foley after all these years because by the end of the night, I won my first WWE championship. All anyone cared about was him falling off the cell. I still tell Mick I will never forgive him. Mick and Taker not only set the tone for the whole night, but almost and unintentionally put a major kink in my match with Austin. We were all backstage at gorilla position, the spot behind the curtain where members of the production team sit, watching Hell in a Cell. Today, it is common knowledge among fans that Taker's move, the one that threw Mick off the cell, was planned. However, when he got chokeslammed through the top of the cell, that was not planned. The cage was not supposed to give, but it did. That surprised everyone, especially Mick. It was the most brutal bump Mankind took all night, more so than the one he got by being thrown off the top of the cell. We honestly didn't know if Mick was going to get back up. But of course, being the hardcore legend, he did. Watching the monitor, I was like, oh my God, Mick's a buddy of mine. Thank goodness he's alive. As Mick miraculously carried on with the match, Vince looked at me. He didn't look at anyone else standing around watching the monitor. Just me. I can tell you that is not a comfortable feeling. Think about it. I'm not even a year into the Kane character. I'm wrestling the hottest commodity since Hulk Hogan, and the boss of the company is staring me down in this perilous moment. Vince looked at me and said, if Mick can't go back out there, you're going to have to figure out what to do in your match. Mankind was scheduled to come out and interfere in our title match along with Undertaker, and what he did would have a lot to do with the finish. But I was looking at Vince and thinking, me? What do you mean, me? That's why you have writers and all these other people around. Austin and I went out there after Hell in a Cell and didn't know what was going to happen at the end of our match. What would we do without the Mankind run-in? But Mick still came out. He really is the toughest man alive. Mick ran out and attacked Austin with the chair, but Steve took care of him immediately. Taker came out, hit Austin with the chair, threw me out of the ring, and then did the same to Mick. I got back up and blasted Taker with the chair, and then tried to attack Austin with it. Austin jumped off the top turnbuckle, taking me down, and then started hitting me with the chair. As I lay on the mat with Austin standing over me, chair in hand, the referee called for the bell. Austin was bleeding. I, or someone, had drawn first blood. The match was over. I was announced as the winner and new WWE champion. Monday Night Raw in Cleveland. Raw the next night was in Cleveland. So, after the match, Paul and I drove the 2+ hours to get there. When we arrived, I booked a double room, but not for Paul. He got his own room. One bed was for me, and the other was for my WWE Championship. The title slept by itself that night. The thing is, I knew I was going to lose the title the next night, but in that moment, I didn't care. It was amazing. I went backstage after the match for a photo shoot with the title, as new champs customarily do. I could have pinched myself. No matter what happened from that point forward, I had accomplished something no one was ever going to be able to take away from me. How many people have worn the WWE title? At the time of this writing, there have been only 51 world champions in the 56-year history of the title. They represent the best of the best in our industry. Now, I had joined their ranks. Even though I was able to keep it for just a day, it was a big deal. I barely slept. The next day, Paul and I were getting ready to go to the show, and he asked, "How did you sleep?" I told him I didn't sleep well. "I'm tired," I admitted. Paul jokingly replied, "Well, you know, son, it's hard carrying the entire company on your back." Paul had been around a lot longer than I had. He knew what holding the world title meant within the business, and more importantly, to the person holding it. There's no way that anyone can understand what this momentous occasion means to my son and myself this evening," Paul Bearer said in the middle of the ring at the beginning of Raw the next night. He was in character, but he wasn't lying. Paul and I stood in the middle of the ring with Vince McMahon, Sergeant Slaughter, Jerry Briscoe, and the WWE Championship, which was on display in a glass case before us. In a long promo, Paul said that I had always dreamed of being WWE Champion and that I had had posters of Undertaker all over my walls during my 20 years as a child. Not sure how the math works, but it worked with the crowd that night. "Undertaker, tonight, for the first time, you are standing in the shadow of your little brother," Paul declared. We were setting it up to look like I would challenge Taker again, only this time as WWE Champion. That's when the glass broke and Austin walked out. Austin got in Vince's face and said that in the first blood match, the winner is the one who draws first blood on his opponent. Looking at Vince and me, Steve explained, as only Stone Cold Steve Austin could, that it was Undertaker, not Kane, who had busted Austin open. "The reason I'm out here is I want a rematch with Kane right here tonight," Austin said. The crowd was on their feet. As Vince hemmed and hawed about a rematch, Austin interrupted him and said to the fans, "If you want a rematch, give me a hell yeah." "Hell yeah," the crowd exploded. After Austin bullied Vince and then Paul and basically did everything he could to goad me into giving him a rematch, he said, "What I'm asking you for the last time is, will you give me that rematch tonight?" With the camera zoomed in on my face, I nodded my head up and down. It was on. As we talked backstage about how the match would go down that night, Austin said, "Kane goes out last. He's champion." He insisted on it. I thought that was pretty cool. Steve didn't have to do that. We went back and forth throughout the match, inside and outside the ring. Paul hit Steve with his shoe. Taker came out. We tried to raise doubts in fans' minds as to whether Austin was going to win. But all they wanted to see was Austin win the title back. They wanted it so bad. When I set Steve up for a tombstone piledriver, it looked like it might be all over for Austin. Yet he got out, kicked me in the stomach, and tried to give me the stunner, his famous three-quarter face-lock jawbreaker maneuver. I broke out of it and slung him into the ropes. When he came back, I tried to kick him, and he ducked. He then kicked me and hit me with the stunner. He went down and hooked my leg for the count. The crowd was going insane. In unison, the entire arena yelled, 1, 2, 3. Your new champion, Stone Cold Steve Austin. The Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse that night was the most electric crowd I've ever been in front of. When I think about, or am asked about, the biggest moments in my career, the turning points, the Attitude Era, and anything else associated with Kane, I always go back to that night in Cleveland. If Austin had just beaten me at the pay-per-view and at Raw, just blown through me, it wouldn't have meant anything. But for me to win the title at King of the Ring and lose it 24 hours later to arguably the biggest superstar in the history of our sport at the height of his career, that meant everything. There are two schools of thinking when it comes to champions. Some bookers look at baby faces or good guys and their ability to draw. Other bookers look at heels, but it's still all about the baby face and his ability to draw by playing off the heel. Kane was an unbeatable monster. I gave Austin a goal he wouldn't have had otherwise. The title switch shot him up even higher in popularity. That episode was one of the highest rated in Raw history at that point. I was even more proud of losing the title to Steve than I had been of taking it from him because I thought I had really helped boost the momentum of the company. More than just helping Steve, I thought Kane was contributing in the biggest way yet to the success of WWE. That meant more to me than anything. In addition to my public service, the Kane character has been the proudest moment in my professional life. The reason I became known around the world. And frankly, it had a lot to do with getting me elected mayor. Let's face it, Kane is the reason you're listening to this audiobook. That magical night in the summer of 1998 might have boosted Austin, but I think it also cemented my legacy, no matter what came next. Chapter 5, WWE versus the Volcano and Other Road Stories. Anyone who has worked for WWE will tell you that the hardest part of the job is the travel schedule. As a WWE superstar, you can expect to spend upwards of 250 nights a year on the road. That schedule is year-round. There are no breaks for holidays or weekends. Sadly, you'll miss time with your family. You'll miss your kids' ball games, plays, parties, and dances. That's the bad part. It's the trade-off for being a success in sports entertainment. But in those many hours away from home, you'll also forge unbreakable bonds with some of your colleagues. You'll see the world in different cultures, and you'll have stories that most people won't believe. Here are some of mine. Sorry, wrong room. The bell had just rung, indicating the start of the last match at the TV taping in Anaheim. I was flying out of LAX the next morning and wanted to beat the crowd out of the arena. My match was close to the end of the night, so as soon as it was over, I hustled backstage and quickly got out of my ring gear. Instead of showering, I put on my workout clothes, shorts, a tank top, and sneakers, and ran out to the car. I arrived at my hotel about 45 minutes later. My appearance drew some stares as I waited in the check-in line. After all, I was 6 foot 8 inches tall, 315 pounds, with my hair in a ponytail that went halfway down my back. At the time, I was under the mask, and I wore black paint around my eyes to blend in with the mask and make my appearance more ominous. As I sweated, the paint often rubbed off, leaving residue around my eyes that looked like runny mascara. All I wanted to do was get up to my room, go to bed, and grab a few hours of sleep. Once I had my room key, I took the elevator up to the guest rooms. Luckily, the hall was empty, so no more weird looks. I got to my room, inserted the key in the lock, opened the door, and kind of tossed my bags into the room. This was a habit I developed because the automatic door closers in hotels seemed to have it out for me. Inevitably, during the times when I pulled my bag behind me into the room, the door would shut right when I was halfway through and catch my bags, forcing me to struggle just to get into the room. So I had learned to push the bags through first. So, in go the bags, and I'm walking through the door when I am greeted by shrieks of terror. The room was already occupied by an elderly Japanese couple. If someone who looked like I did, immense, scant clothing, long hair, and mascara, burst into my hotel room unannounced, I would scream too. There was an awkward second or so. Me just standing there, them standing on the bed, clutching each other in a desperate embrace and screaming in Japanese at the tops of their lungs. I figured damage control was out of the question. I just grabbed my bags, mumbled an apology, and went back down to the lobby. When I got there, I could see that the clerk was in a panic. It was clear that he was speaking with the folks who I had just scared the dickens out of. No, there's no need to call the police, he stammered. Yes, we'll take care of your breakfast in the morning. I got another room, which was, fortunately, unoccupied and had an uneventful rest of the night. Of course, I've never again seen that elderly Japanese couple, but if I do, I hope they'll at least thank me for a complimentary breakfast. Terre Haute, Illinois. The parking lot outside the Bank of Springfield Center in Springfield, Illinois, was small and always crowded. Fans stood on the adjacent sidewalk, not 30 feet from the backstage door. I was sitting in the driver's seat, waiting on my traveling partner, trainer Larry Heck, and punching into his GPS the coordinates for Terre Haute. Our next date was in Terre Haute, Indiana, the next state over. Larry slammed the trunk and jumped into the passenger seat. "Let's go," he said. I hit the go button on his GPS, and away we went. It was a nasty night. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by the deep rumble of thunder. We drove through some side streets, got a burger at a fast food drive-thru, and finally got onto the highway. Even with the bad weather, I was looking forward to an easy 2.5-hour drive and an early night, hitting the sack a little after midnight. The rain got worse, which slowed us somewhat. Larry and I filled the time with small talk and jokes. After a couple of hours, Larry pulled out his phone and started fiddling with it. I was lost in my own thoughts when I heard Larry mutter, "Oh no." Larry's a news junkie, so I figured he had seen something on a news website or social media. "What's up?" I asked. Larry giggled and replied, "Did you know there is a Terre Haute, Illinois?" "Nope," I answered. Larry laughed outright before exclaiming, "Well, you do now, because we're almost there." "What?" I exclaimed. Larry showed me his phone screen. He pulled up the mapping app, and it showed us just a few miles from Terre Haute, Illinois. "Oh, man," I said. Larry hit a couple of buttons on his GPS, and sure enough, it showed we were in Terre Haute, Illinois, and not Terre Haute, Indiana. In my haste to leave the arena, I'd selected the first Terre Haute the GPS displayed. How many Terre Hautes are there? Wonderful. Just wonderful, I thought to myself. Larry punched in the correct destination, and we turned around, drove back through the thunderstorms, passed through Springfield, where we could see the arena from the highway, before finally pulling into our hotel in the right Terre Haute at 5 a.m. Larry and I had a combined 35 years on the road. Knowing how embarrassing this episode would be, we made a pact to never tell anyone. Of course, as soon as I got to the arena the next day, I couldn't resist. As soon as I walked into the locker room, I announced, "You all will never guess what Larry and I did last night." The Reggie Jackson incident. American Airlines was on strike, and it had thrown a monkey wrench into my travel plans. I was supposed to fly from LaGuardia Airport in New York to Miami, but my flight was canceled due to the strike. Since Miami was one of American's hubs, most commercial flights going there were on American, and they were all grounded. After 2 days trying to get out, I was booked on the last seat on a Delta flight. Beggars can't be choosers, so I was happy to get any seat at all, even the middle seat that I had. Not that I was looking forward to flying for 3 hours in such cramped quarters, but it beat the alternative of missing my booking in Miami. All of these thoughts were running through my mind as I stood in line at the ticket counter at LaGuardia. I was, admittedly, not in the best of moods when the guy behind me said, "Man, you're a big guy. Are you a wrestler or something?" The question rubbed me the wrong way. I was frustrated and didn't want to talk to anyone. Without turning around, I responded sarcastically, "Yes, I'm a wrestler, not a something." I immediately regretted saying that. I was trying to be funny, sarcastic, but it came out as plain old mean sarcastic. The guy didn't respond, and I felt about 6 inches tall. Just because I was having a bad day didn't mean that I should be taking it out on anyone else. Still facing forward, I said, "I'm sorry. I was trying to be funny. I've had a bad couple of days." "That's okay. I hear you. People say stuff like that to me all the time." "I'm Reggie Jackson," he replied. That statement hung in the air for a second as I digested it. Yes, the voice sounded familiar. Now, I'd have to play it cool. For the first time, I snuck a look at the figure behind me. Sure enough, it was Mr. October, Reggie Jackson himself. I was mortified and embarrassed. Karma had come back around quickly. It was my turn to go to the ticket counter, so I mumbled another apology and left with my proverbial tail between my legs. For many years, I took for granted how much my WWE fame touched people. Despite pursuing careers that put me in the spotlight, I'm a natural introvert, and I've had to make an effort to come out of my shell. Early in my career, I was not as friendly and outgoing as I should have been, not because I was mean and arrogant, but because I was shy and uncomfortable. Then, one day, Crystal and I were having lunch at a restaurant in Knoxville. I had just returned home from a road trip and was tired and grumpy. I was starting to get frustrated as people stopped at our table and asked for a picture or an autograph. "Man, I wish they'd leave me alone," I muttered. "Honey, what you need to understand is," Crystal replied, "because you're on TV, meeting you is one of the most exciting things that some people will ever experience." I wouldn't admit it at the time, but she was right. It wasn't about me. It was about giving people a good experience. The choice was up to me. I could look at this attention, people wanting autographs and pictures, as a burden and a hassle. Or I could think about it as an opportunity to bring folks joy and happiness. I decided to choose the latter. I could put a smile on my face and be polite and friendly for a few minutes if it meant making other people happy. Then a funny thing happened. I began to like it. In fact, I felt rewarded and fulfilled. I learned a couple of life's lessons. One is that everything is a matter of perspective, and you get to choose what perspective to take. If you want to be miserable, you can be, no matter how good your circumstances. If you choose to be happy, you will find happiness, even when life might not be going as you'd like it to go. The second lesson is that living is about giving. You get what you give. If you are a jerk to people, guess what? You'll be treated like a jerk. If you are nice to folks, on the other hand, they are likely to be good to you. There is no feeling of satisfaction like the one I feel when someone asks to shake my hand and thanks me for giving them years of entertainment. I mean, after all, if they hadn't watched, I wouldn't have had a job. I've had people tell me that as teenagers, they were depressed and felt like outcasts. They also told me that the Kane character, himself an outcast, had inspired them and helped them through a tough time. I once had a waiter in a restaurant tell me that his grandma had been diagnosed with a terminal illness a few years before. She loved WWE, and I was one of her favorites. She lived another 18 months, during which the two of them watched WWE together every chance they could. He thanked me for that. Those experiences are a blessing, and they are something most people will never experience. When people ask me, what's the best thing about being Kane? I tell them that it's the ability to bring joy and happiness into people's lives. It's one of the greatest gifts God has given me. I look back on that day in LaGuardia Airport and some other instances and think about what I should have done differently. Mr. Jackson, if you're listening to this, my apologies. I've grown a lot since then, and I'd love an autograph if you are so inclined. The volcano. On April 14th, 2010, the volcano at Eyjafjallajökull, Iceland, erupted, spewing ash into the atmosphere and creating an ash cloud that led to the grounding of commercial jetliners across Europe, which just happened to be where WWE was touring at the time. Millions of people across Europe had their travel plans disrupted. For me, it was the most arduous few days of travel that I've ever experienced. I hadn't been following the news, so I didn't know anything about the eruption until I arrived in the lobby of our hotel in Hamburg, Germany, on my way to a workout at the local gym. I stopped to talk with our market rep about the travel plans for that day. We had planned to take a charter flight to Zurich that night after the show in Hamburg. Haven't you seen the news about the volcano? He asked. Air travel is shut down. It looks like we're going to stay here tonight and then take a train to Zurich. All righty then. I still didn't think much about it. WWE arranges all our travel when we tour in foreign countries, so it wasn't like I could do anything about it anyway. My main concern was just getting to the bus on time. After that, I followed the rest of the herd. When I got to the gym and saw that every television station was following the volcanic eruption story, I realized it was a big deal. By the time I got back to the hotel, WWE officials, road agents Ricky Steamboat and Fit Finley, along with the local event staff, were making sure that everyone was aware of the change in travel plans for that night. Plans for the rest of the tour, they said, were uncertain. At the same time, another WWE team was touring in the United Kingdom, where things were even worse. That crew was expected to be stranded in Belfast until conditions improved, whenever that might be. Early the next day, we left the hotel to catch the first train to Zurich. We took just our gear bags. The rest of our luggage went into a cargo van, which was to meet us in Zurich. I had a ticket in the first class cabin on the train. Unlike in an airplane, first class and coach in the train were the same thing, except first class ticket holders had their own little room to sit in. It's a little over 500 miles from Hamburg to Zurich, which meant about an 8-hour train ride. When the train first took off, I thought we'd be there in no time. We were flying at more than 100 miles per hour, but I soon realized that would not be the case. The problem was we were stopping at a station every few minutes. We'd be at a station for a minute or two and take off again. There was a snack bar on one of the other cars, and after a few hours on the train, boredom and hunger drove me to step out of my cabin and head that way. What I saw shocked me. At all those stops we were making, it seemed that no one got off the train. But a lot of people had gotten on. The car was so packed with people that I couldn't make it to the snack bar. At the far end of the cabin, baggage was stacked from floor to ceiling. I turned around, went back into my cabin, and grumpily settled in for the rest of the trip. We arrived in Zurich to board tour buses, which took us to the building just in time so we could do the show. After the event, we waited to hear the plans for the rest of the tour. Originally, we had been scheduled for another day in Europe and then a final show in Istanbul, Turkey. Everybody was excited about the Istanbul show. It was our debut there, and it was sold out with an expected crowd of 20,000. Back in Stamford, WWE personnel were scrambling to figure out what to do. Airline travel was disrupted and spotty. Meanwhile, ground travel was quickly booked. Later, I read in Time magazine that John Cleese of Monty Python fame racked up a $5,400 taxicab bill trying to get home to London from Norway. WWE had to deal with the same thing as all forms of alternative transportation. Trains, ferries, and buses were quickly becoming unavailable. Over the next couple of hours, we got sporadic information. The first bit of bad news was that the show in Istanbul was canceled. WWE was trying to get us back to the United States as soon as possible to make sure we were there in time for TV. Finally, we were told our tour buses would take us to the airport in Geneva, since our drivers would legally be timed out when they got there, meaning they would have to take 8 hours off to rest. We transferred into 2 luxury coaches that were going to take us from Geneva to Madrid, Spain, about 900 miles, then fly on a charter to Newark, New Jersey. It sounded tedious, but at least there was a plan. The 4-hour drive to Geneva went smoothly. When we arrived at the airport, we saw 2 nice tour buses that we thought were waiting for us, but our driver sped past them. A little farther on, we saw 2 small cargo-type vans, think hotel shuttle buses. Those were the vehicles that were taking us across France and deep into Spain. These misnamed luxury coaches were so small that we had to leave some of our personnel at the airport in Geneva because there was no room for them on the buses. As I walked around the bus to which I had been assigned, I noticed the tires were bald and missing a lug nut here and there. Scott Aycock from our security team used to drive a tour bus. We made eye contact after both of us saw the condition of the tires. Scott just shook his head. Still, we piled into the buses, humans and luggage, and took off. Our bus had a bathroom. Unfortunately, the driver didn't have the key, and it was locked. Now keep in mind, we were already working on a 20-hour day. I was lucky to have a seat to myself, and I fell asleep with my head against the window. When I woke up, we made a quick stop to go to the bathroom and grab some drinks and snacks. By this time, the sun was rising. Traffic was blowing by us. I looked at the speedometer and saw we were only going about 40 miles an hour on the highway. We had planned on arriving in Madrid a few hours before the flight left. WWE had even reserved day rooms at the airport hotel so that we could shower and relax while we waited. I bet they thought we were going to be going more than 40 miles an hour, I thought to myself dejectedly. But there was an even bigger problem. The airport in Madrid had a midnight curfew. Our plane was scheduled to be back in the United States the next morning. In other words, it was leaving at midnight, with or without us. Additionally, our drivers spoke French. None of us did. So we faced a communication barrier. Luckily, Rey Mysterio said something in Spanish, and one of the drivers perked up and told Rey he, too, spoke Spanish. At that moment, Rey became the most important person on our bus. We stopped in Barcelona for a late lunch. At this point, we were 30 hours from Hamburg. Madrid was another 400 miles. As slow as our bus was going, we'd be lucky to get there by next week, much less before midnight. After a quick bite, it was back on the bus. No one was happy. The trip had been grueling, and you could see it on everyone's face. By this time, our poor bus was feeling its load. The engine strained to keep up with traffic on the highway. It was slightly unnerving to see the drivers pull out the owner's manual, point to it, and speak to each other in hushed voices. At one point, we pulled over at a convenience store, and one of the drivers ran inside, returned with some engine oil, popped the hood, and poured it in. On and on we drove. Hours turned into days, or at least it seemed like it. By now, dusk was settling over the Iberian Peninsula. We finally began seeing road signs for Madrid. Our hopes rose, just like the mountains in front of us. Although I was born in Madrid, I was unaware of its geography. Little did I know that it lies about 20 miles south of the Sierra de Guadarrama mountain range, through which we were now driving. Mountain ranges and an overloaded luxury coach are not a good combination. A turtle could have beaten our little bus up the steep hills. Every vehicle on the road, even the semi-trucks, was flying past us. We would get to the top of one peak, build up some pretty good speed going downhill, and then be confronted with an even steeper climb when we started up the next hill. Maybe it was my imagination, but I think one of the drivers even made the sign of the cross as the little bus that could started up a particularly steep grade. What was not my imagination were the warning lights on the dashboard. They were lit like a Christmas tree. I thought that at any second, we'd hear bang, pop, signals that our bus's engine had finally blown and our trip would end on the side of the road. Miraculously, that didn't happen. We cleared the last peak and saw the lights of Madrid before us. We were going to make it after all. The bus seemed to share our newfound enthusiasm. It picked up speed as we entered the outskirts of Madrid and finally the airport. It was 11 o'clock or so. The midnight curfew was dangling over our heads like the sword of Damocles. It was going to be close, but we felt we were going to make it. We pulled up to the main terminal, only to discover our flight wasn't leaving from there. The international terminal was on the other side of the airport. The bus was not equipped with GPS, however, so we weren't sure where to go. Until this point, everyone had remained in fairly good spirits, talking with one another. Now, you could hear a pin drop. You've got to be kidding me, I thought to myself, as I'm sure everyone else did. We've been traveling for like 2 days, and we're going to miss the flight because we got lost in the terminal? Luckily, Fit Finley's bus was already at the correct terminal, and he guided us in via cell phone. We unloaded our bags, sprinted through security, boarded the plane, and lifted off at 11:53 p.m., a full 7 minutes before the airport closed, which would have stranded us in Spain for who knows how long. By the time we arrived in Newark, 46 hours had elapsed since our departure from Hamburg. As almost always happens in WWE, the show went on. We arrived in Newark around midnight on Saturday. We had Sunday off. On Monday, Raw was broadcast live from Newark's Izod Arena as if nothing had even happened. Chapter 6, Brothers of Destruction. After my showdown with Austin, I began tag teaming with Mankind. It wasn't our first time as a team, but the program Mick and I would work against Austin and Taker, rivals who had briefly teamed up, would have a lot to do with the next big evolution for the Kane character. Have a nice day, Kane and Mankind. On a Monday Night Raw in July 1998, just 2 weeks after I dropped the WWE title to Austin, Mick and I defeated the New Age Outlaws, Road Dogg Jesse James, and Badass Billy Gunn for the WWE Tag Team titles. We would then lose the titles to Austin and Taker. Mick and I would then regain the tag titles from Austin and Taker in a fatal four-way match on Raw that included the New Age Outlaws and the Nation of Domination's The Rock and D'Lo Brown. There was a lot of switching back and forth during that time for everyone at the top of the card, in both titles and partners. All of it had to do with pushing WWE's franchise player, Austin, particularly building up his big match at SummerSlam with Undertaker. Mick and I had a lot of fun working together because we were such good friends. One story I'll never forget took place in a Hell in a Cell match on Raw when Kane had a falling out with Mankind. Mick was adamant about using thumbtacks in our match. He thought it would add a lot to Kane versus Mankind. I didn't want to use thumbtacks. I was like, Mick, we're already using chairs and doing all this other cool stuff. We don't need the thumbtacks. Because I had the utmost respect for him, we ended up using thumbtacks. The deal was, I would not have to fall on the tacks. Mankind wanted to use them, and it was Mick, and Mick alone, who was going to suffer any consequences. Fine by me. When we got to that spot in the match, Mick wound me up for a pile driver, and when my back went towards his face, I lost my balance. I not only fell right into the thumbtacks, I sat right down in them. So, not only were thumbtacks sticking all over me, including my hands, which really hurts, like paper cuts, but much worse, my backside was covered in tacks. Almost my entire butt was silver. Not very monstrous, to say the least. It was really embarrassing. I had so many tacks in the soles of my boots that I was picking them out for 2 months. I told you we didn't need thumbtacks, I yelled at Mick. He just laughed. Mick and I were great together, particularly as two dark characters. I remember one night when Shawn Michaels was on commentary, and he said that what made us so dangerous is that you have one guy, Kane, who doesn't feel anything, and another, Mankind, who likes it, the pain. Wrestling is the weirdest business in the world. A business where, after a guy hits you in the back with a steel chair, you thank him later for it. And when your friend helps drive you into hundreds of thumbtacks, you both end up agreeing it was a good match. At SummerSlam that year, Mick and I were supposed to defend our tag team titles in a hardcore tag team match against Road Dogg and Billy Gunn. I no-showed, and therefore Mankind had to wrestle alone. Needless to say, the New Age Outlaws won that de facto handicap match and became the new tag team champions. After being announced as new champs, Road Dogg and Billy told Mankind they were going to put him in the garbage where you belong. They tossed Mick in a dumpster, closed the lid, and walked off. Once they were gone, I popped up out of the dumpster holding a sledgehammer, ready to smash Mick's head in. And I did. No one could see Mankind lying in the bottom of the dumpster, but they could hear it when I caved his skull in with the hammer. What they actually heard was me smashing a giant watermelon. Kane was Gallagher for a night. But perhaps the funniest part about that match had nothing to do with what took place in the ring. SummerSlam was at Madison Square Garden that year, and I remember pushing a dumpster backstage. Being New York City, of course, everything was run by the unions. As I was pushing it along, a bunch of workers said that I couldn't touch the dumpster. They said it was against union rules. I was like, okay. I told them that rules or not, I had to push the dumpster from backstage to the main stage for the match I was about to have. The union guys said that would be all right because once it got to the stage, it would no longer be under their jurisdiction. Then it would become a prop. That night, I learned the technical definitions of a dumpster and a prop. Pretty silly, right? There were actually regulations that forbade me from pushing around a dumpster for a wrestling match. Ridiculous. I wasn't as overtly political then as I would become later, but maybe that was the real beginning of me becoming a libertarian. Mankind and Kane were a pretty good team while it lasted, but it was certainly not the most famous tag team I was part of. Not even close. 1998, a year of brotherly destruction. As we slowly built toward the Brothers of Destruction throughout 1998, I didn't know that's what we were doing. Neither did Taker. I don't think many, if anyone, in WWE realized that's where we were heading. Sometimes people think WWE has everything mapped out. That's not always the case, and it certainly wasn't in the evolution of the relationship between Kane and Undertaker. After Austin beat me for the title at Raw in Cleveland after King of the Ring, Undertaker stepped over the ropes to stare down Stone Cold Steve Austin, the rattlesnake. When Taker turned to leave the ring, Austin stunned him, and fans saw both Taker and Kane lying flat on our backs. As Austin was walking up the ramp, celebrating with the entire Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse going insane, Taker and I both sat up, dead man style. Then we both stood up simultaneously. We stared down Austin, who by now was standing at the top of the ramp. He looked right back at us, eyes locked on the two brothers. That's how Raw went off the air that night. Imagine the scene. Many of you might remember it. The biggest star in the wrestling world just winning the WWE title, facing off against two of the company's most popular characters at the height of the Attitude Era. It's a time I'll never forget, and I know many fans feel the same way. Little by little, the Brothers of Destruction act was taking shape. We dropped seeds at different intervals for months. The running theme that gave birth to this formidable alliance would be the same at virtually every turn. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The first seed Taker and I planted, as I discussed earlier, was at the Raw before the 1998 Royal Rumble in State College, Pennsylvania, when I ran out to save Mark from DX. Everyone thought I was there to save my brother. And I was, until I burned him alive in a casket. By the summer of 1998, we were starting to pair together more often. I would play a significant role in the Austin versus Undertaker main event at SummerSlam. Remember, I had abandoned Mankind in the tag match earlier in the night before smashing Mick with a sledgehammer. I'd like to think that was revenge for the thumbtacks. During the Austin Taker main event, I walked down and stood at ringside mid-match. Taker ordered me to the back. I followed his orders. Austin ended up defeating Taker, and when Mark stepped out of the ring, I joined him once again. Undertaker and Kane stood at the entrance staring down the victorious Stone Cold. Steve celebrated his win, but his eyes were fixed on Mark and me. His reaction to us was important to our storyline development. Stone Cold saw Undertaker and Kane standing there and seemed to be thinking, without saying a word, "Oh no." To have Steve acknowledge us in that way really helped sell our alliance because everyone realized Austin was generally worried about us. The rowdy, beer-swilling everyman hero who doesn't worry about anything was all of a sudden really concerned about the dead man and the big red machine and what they might do to him. Sometimes it's subtleties like this that are the most important aspect of our business. WWE is often accused of being over the top because, well, we are. But it is the little things, like Steve's reaction that night, that end up being the best material. People often miss that. Similarly, I did very little in Steve and Taker's SummerSlam match. Merely walking out intermittently was all it took to reveal, for the first time explicitly, that Undertaker and Kane were working together. Believe it or not, even at this point, I still wasn't privy to where all this was headed, and I don't think Taker was either. Sometimes, the most memorable things that happen in WWE are not pre-planned, but instead evolve organically. The evolution of the Brothers of Destruction is a perfect example. Though the Kane character was originally created for the sole purpose of giving Undertaker a monster heel opponent, Vince knew that, over time, WWE could make more money if the brothers joined forces rather than opposing each other. The fans had been dying to see us together, going all the way back to that night at Raw in State College, Pennsylvania in 1998. I was completely happy to be working with Mick after losing the title to Austin, and if, after all, I had been featured in the lower card and then phased out altogether, I wouldn't have been surprised. I would have been happy for my success. Few in our business get to that level for any period of time. Performance and timing are both important, but even these components aren't necessarily everything. Isaac Yankum had been a failure, partly because I didn't do it very well. I thought I did a good job as Fake Diesel, but in the end, I was Fake Diesel, a character whose shelf life proved to be short. After playing two characters that had gone nowhere, I was now Kane, in the mix with Austin, Taker, Mick, and The Rock for however long this character would last. After WrestleMania, so many thought I would just fade away. I was constantly appreciating the fact that I hadn't. It was all just sort of happening. And when I was working with Mick, I had no idea that 6 months later, I would be allied with Undertaker as half of one of the greatest tag teams in WWE history. At the next pay-per-view, Breakdown, held on September 27th, 1998, the main event was a triple threat among Kane, Undertaker, and Austin for the title, with the stipulation that Mark and I could not pin each other. It was, by design, a de facto handicap match. But we both chokeslammed Austin. More importantly, we both pinned Steve. Stone Cold had lost the world title, but who won it? That night, no one knew. Vince grabbed the title, ran through the backstage area, and jumped into a limousine. Austin chased him. As the show went off the air, Vince stood by his limo and held the title high, yelling at Steve, "You see this? You don't have it anymore. It's mine. It's mine." Then Vince flipped Austin the Bird, as Stone Cold so often did to him, and sped off. It was awesome. As for the actual match that night, I remember Austin, Taker, and me sitting in the locker room feeling disappointed because it didn't appear to have gotten the reaction we wanted. We knew what the audience really wanted was for Austin to beat either Taker or me, and when that didn't happen, for us, it just didn't seem to gel. We were bummed. But Vince thought it was great. He was good with everything we did. In WWE, sometimes the performers are hard on themselves because they think they didn't deliver or underperformed in some fashion, while Vince is happy as long as he got what he wanted out of it. Vince wanted Austin to lose the title and for us to do the double pin that night. That's what happened, so the boss was happy. Steve lost, but still looked strong. What human being could possibly pop out of being pinned by both Kane and Undertaker? If you look at the entirety of the angle, to this day, so many fans remember Vince standing beside his limo at the end of the show, holding up the title and shooting Austin the Bird. Vince's facial expression alone was priceless. Again, the subtleties. We were a part of that. And even though we were unhappy with our particular performances in the ring, Vince saw the bigger picture. He always does. While much of what happens in WWE is more spontaneous than many realize, it's also no secret that Vince has the ability to look into the future and see storylines and just about everything else. Bruce Pritchard says Vince was talking about a concept similar to the WWE Network as far back as the mid-1980s during the Hulkamania era. Probably better than anyone else in the history of sports entertainment. Case in point, that same night, as Austin, Taker, and I were sitting backstage, Vince said to me, "Don't go stone-faced under your mask, because at some point, you're not going to be wearing it anymore." Steve snickered. He asked Vince, "Why do you want to take his mask off? He's doing great." I was thinking the same thing. But as we all know, my mask eventually did come off. A move that breathed even more life into an ever-evolving Kane character. But the point is, Vince always thinks long-term. My mask wouldn't come off for another 5 years. But on that night, way back in 1998, Vince was already envisioning it. The next night, the Brothers of Destruction would take another step. The Brothers destroy Vince McMahon. "I'm about to present the WWE Championship," Vince said in the middle of the ring on Raw in Detroit, Michigan. The vacant title that both Taker and I had won the night prior, but one that neither of us had really won since we both pinned Austin, lay unclaimed in a glass case. However, if you recall, the deal was, Undertaker and Kane, you would get the title shot as long as you kept Stone Cold Steve Austin away from me, Vince scolded. But three times in less than a week, Austin has brutally attacked me. The crowd cheered for that. So let me say this. You didn't live up to your end of the deal. I'm not going to live up to mine, Vince growled right in Taker's face. Vince said that at the next pay-per-view, Taker and I would have to battle it out for the title, with Austin as the guest referee. Whether you like it or not, he added. We didn't like it. So, we broke Vince's leg with the steel stairs. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Jim Ross screamed. I was pretty much screaming the same thing on the inside. When you are supposed to break the boss's leg in a storyline, you really don't want to break the boss's leg. I was so nervous about that angle that night. Years after this, when I would end up tombstoning Linda McMahon on the stage, her safety was the most important thing on my mind. Believe me, there was no way she was going to get hurt. I had the same super cautious attitude with Vince that night. How could I not? But while I was nervous, Taker was ready to hammer him. Vince always took great pleasure in ribbing Mark, so Mark was going to take any opportunity he could find to get him back. Taker wasn't going to hurt him in reality, but if he had an opportunity to chokeslam Vince, he was going to chokeslam him. If he was going to tombstone piledrive Vince, he was going to piledrive him. And that night, if Mark was supposed to break Vince's leg with the steel stairs, he was definitely going to have some fun with it. Vince would later start ribbing me in the same way he always had with Taker. I would be out in the ring with someone that didn't make sense on any level or in some angle that I thought was completely ridiculous, and Vince would say, "You're never going to stop paying your dues, Glenn," and then walk off laughing. Though that night I was nervous that we might hurt Vince, 6 years later, I would end up having the same attitude as Taker. Vince is one of the greatest performers in the history of our business, and part of that means that he's not afraid to get beat up, look foolish, take risks, or do any of the many things he has always done to make the Mr. McMahon character such a great heel. And he never would have complained or held it against you if you actually hurt him. That risk is always part of the deal in our business, and he understood that. As 1999 approached, Undertaker and Kane began drifting apart. At the Rock Bottom pay-per-view in Vancouver, Canada in December 1998, I interfered in the Buried Alive match between Austin and Taker, where I tombstone Mark and then pushed him into an open grave. Steve then buried him with a backhoe for the win. So much for brotherly love. That same month, December's WWE Raw magazine featured both Mark and me on the cover holding sledgehammers with the caption, "Bang Your Head, a look at Taker and Kane's greatest hits." We certainly had many hits in 1998, a year that proved pivotal for the Attitude Era. But for Taker and me, it will always go down as the year the Brothers of Destruction were born. Our alliance will always be the most famous pairing for either of us, and a go-to for the company for the next 2 decades. Neither Taker nor me have ever taken for granted that enduring fan appreciation.
All right. That is the end of part 2 of Mayor Kane, My Life in Wrestling and Politics audio part 2. This was a little bit longer than the previous part, but we are in right now, according to this audiobook, going into chapter 8. So there will be some quite more chapters, and according to the looks of it, there may be a 4th part in addition to the 3rd part. As I said before, the part 3 do come out, keep the notifications on, and make sure you guys can know when I release the 3rd part and possibly a 4th part. And there will be a link in the description to the previous part in each part that comes out of the audiobook. I thank you all for coming out. Great audiobook. Kane's going into when they 1999 in the middle of the Attitude Era. So thank you all for coming out. There will be a part 3 and possibly part 4. Soon 2 videos will pop up. One will be Mayor Kane, My Life in Wrestling and Politics, audio part 1. Next video will be Chris Jericho, No, It's a 4-letter word, audio part 1. Until then, it is OUT.